Hello, and welcome to Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, a small corner where curiosity can curl up comfortably and science slows down enough for your thoughts to drift and soften before sleep. Tonight we'll follow a question that hums quietly under everything we've constructed, everything we tread on, and everything we think we understand about where we came from. What if we aren't the first? What if another civilization rose long before ours? Not merely thousands, but tens, or even hundreds of thousands of years in the past. And what if the faint traces of that world are still around us now, hiding in plain sight, woven through legends, buried under ages of stone and sediment, waiting for us to finally pay attention? It's an uneasy idea. We like our history arranged neatly in a single line. Cave paintings, then pyramids, then kingdoms and empires, then steel and glass skyscrapers all pointing in one direction, ending here with us. But what if that simple line is only a superficial sketch laid over a much deeper, older tale? What if the Earth remembers more than it reveals? It could be that beneath soil and ocean, directly under our feet, lie the faint fingerprints of a civilization that rose, flourished, and vanished long before our own story began. Where are you listening from tonight? Maybe you're somewhere quiet. A darkened bedroom, a dim corner with a soft lamp, a train seat at night, curtains drawn against the world. Wherever you are, pause for a moment and think about the ground beneath you. How many layers of time lie stacked below that point? How many generations of life have appeared and disappeared on that same small patch of earth? The dust under your floorboards might cradle grains of quartz that have rested there, in one form or another, for millions of years. If this planet had a memory the way we have a mind, what would it recall about us? And what might it still remember about any who lived, built, dreamed, and disappeared before we arrived? If slow, meandering explorations like this feel calming to you, it would mean a lot if you nudged this little corner of the internet along, perhaps by liking, subscribing, or sharing, so that it can drift toward others who find comfort in quiet mysteries. For now, settle in. Let your breathing deepen and slow. Let's look gently at what it would mean if the very first civilization on Earth left clues scattered across continents, half hidden, half forgotten, quietly waiting for someone to understand them. The notion that others came before us is not a new one. It lives inside old stories, in hushed traditions, in the way so many ancient narratives begin not with once upon a time, but with something like, before our people, there were others. Archaeologists, geologists, and anyone who can't help asking questions have always found that phrase irresistible. Because each time we probe a little deeper, physically with shovels and drills, or mentally with new ideas, the boundary between legend and history becomes softer, less defined. We often place the beginning of civilization with ancient Sumer around 6,000 years ago. The rise of writing, cities, organized agriculture, early laws, and governments. But what if that was not the first beginning, but the latest restart in a much longer cycle? Every few decades, some discovery appears and gently pushes the walls of our imagination outward. Take Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. When it was dated to more than 11,000 years old, it overturned a major assumption. Here was a monumental site built by hunter-gatherers long before the age of farms and cities, with towering stone pillars carved and arranged in elaborate symbolic patterns. By our old timelines, such a place simply shouldn't exist. Yet it does, heavy, weathered, undeniably real, patient under the sky. Finds like that make researchers wonder how many other enigmatic sites still sleep beneath sediments, disguised as natural hills or long since claimed by rising seas. The Earth is exceptionally skilled at hiding its past. Volcanoes pour new rock over old. Floods rearrange entire landscapes in days. Tectonic plates slowly shove mountains up and drag seafloors down, continually rewriting the surface. Give it only a few thousand years and even our largest cities could be swallowed by forests, deserts, glaciers, or ocean, leaving behind only puzzling remnants for whoever comes after us. If something complex and advanced existed tens of thousands of years ago, would we even recognize its remains today? When we picture a lost civilization, our minds go straight to the great myths: Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu. Those names echo through stories from many cultures, each in a different language but with familiar themes: a radiant age, a great cataclysm, a fall into the sea, memories of people with knowledge far ahead of their time. It's easy to dismiss these as symbolic parables, yet myths often carry more than metaphor. They carry fragments of experience, passed from voice to voice, until the original event is gone, and only its distilled story survives. Geologists know that as the last ice age ended, global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Huge coastal plains vanished. Entire regions that once were habitable are now hidden beneath the waves. If humans or human-like beings had built villages, towns, or even small proto-cities along those ancient shorelines, they would now lie drowned and buried under silt. Today, the continental shelves around the world are dotted with odd features: terraces, steps, walls, and shapes that spark arguments in academic papers and late-night conversations alike. Some are surely natural, sculpted by currents and times. Others, such as the puzzling submerged structure near Yonaguni in Japan, or the stone formations off Malta's coast, invite more questions. Are these the tattered remains of early architecture, or just geological coincidences that resemble it? We don't yet know. But as we map more of the seabed in increasing detail, more anomalies appear. Picture yourself walking across an ancient stone landscape older than any written story. The rock beneath your feet bears faint, straight lines and patterns that don't quite look like chance. They're not decorative in any obvious sense, but deliberate. What were the makers trying to express? What message did they leave etched into stone for eyes that might not see it for tens of thousands of years? And what would they think of us now constructing towers of glass and metal, timing our lives by atomic clocks and satellites, yet still baffled by their quiet handiwork? The possibility that knowledge might not climb in a single unbroken ladder but circle and return in cycles is strangely humbling. It suggests that civilization may be less like an arrow and more like a heartbeat. It reminds us that progress is not guaranteed. It's delicate, like a tall ridge of sand that one strong wave can flatten. The earth does not preserve all things equally. Organic materials disappear quickly. Wood rots, fabrics disintegrate, metals corrode and crumble into unrecognizable powders. Stone, however, endures. That's why our oldest surviving hints of past cultures are usually carved in or built from rock. When archaeologists uncover megalithic sites, great stone circles, pyramids, terraces, and platforms predating any written records, they often find themselves wondering not only how such works were accomplished, but why. Many of these structures go far beyond basic survival needs. They suggest a desire not just to live, but to communicate into the future. Someone long ago wanted to inscribe their presence into time itself. Perhaps that urge to leave something that outlasts us is the most human impulse of all. Even our modern wonders may eventually be reduced to scattered boulders and rubble. Concrete weakens and falls apart. Steel rusts away. Plastics sprout cracks and flake into dust under sunlight and pressure. Imagine a team of future archaeologists poking through the faded foundations of one of our cities 100,000 years from now. They might find only shapeless concrete chunks and strange layers in the soil. No readable texts, no working machines, no intact electronics. They would see grids, right angles, and patterns of alignment. They would infer that someone once lived and built there, but the purpose of our structures and the nuance of our stories might be lost, just as we puzzle over the ruins of ancient builders. They would puzzle over ours. There's something oddly comforting and quietly eerie about that thought. It puts us alongside all who came before, not above them. We become another chapter in a long series of attempts to leave a mark on a planet that, in its own time, erases everything. When scientists discuss such possibilities, they sometimes use a phrase, the Silurian hypothesis. It was proposed by astrophysicists Adam Frank and Gavin Schmidt as a thought experiment. Suppose an industrial civilization had existed millions of years ago, perhaps during the time of the dinosaurs. Would we be able to detect it now? Their answer? Probably not. At least not in the usual way. Geological processes continually recycle the crust. Over millions of years, erosion, plate tectonics, and chemical weathering erase most surface traces. What might remain are only subtle signatures anomalies in sediment layers, strange isotopic patterns, perhaps abrupt spikes in atmospheric carbon, much like the one we are currently creating. In other words, even if an intelligent, organized society had risen and fallen long before us, its traces might be visible only in the rocks and ice, not in obvious ruins. To find them, we would have to read the Earth itself as a historical archive. That idea may sound wild, but what it really underscores is something simple and profound. Civilizations, no matter how advanced, are brief compared to the age of the planet. The monuments we call ancient, the oldest pyramids, the earliest temples, have stood for only a few thousand years. In the language of geology, that's hardly more than a blink. The Earth's ledger runs in millions and billions of years, and our entire story so far occupies only a thin surface line. And yet, even in that vast timescale, certain hints can persist. A strange tool mark on stone, an alignment of structures that serves no obvious practical purpose, a sudden, unexplained shift in the fossil record, a cluster of myths that refuse to fade. Consider the widespread stories of a great flood, the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the biblical tale of Noah, the Hindu story of Manu, the Greek legend of Deucalion. The many traditions of world renewal among Native American peoples all describe a world washed clean by water, with only a small group surviving to begin again. Many scholars now think these tales may preserve memories of real flooding events associated with the chaotic end of the last ice age. As massive ice sheets melted, enormous pulses of fresh water flooded into the oceans, reshaping coastlines and drowning low-lying regions. Imagine standing on ground your ancestors had occupied for generations and watching, week after week, as the shoreline moved inland, devouring familiar fields and villages. To those living through it, it would have felt apocalyptic. Generations later, that traumatic experience could easily transform into legend, a divine deluge, a cleansing of the world, a warning and a remembrance of what was lost. What captivates modern researchers is how well many of these flood stories line up with what geology tells us about that period. It's as if humanity has been trying to warn itself in story form about something it once witnessed, that the world can change abruptly, that entire ways of life can vanish, and that the evidence of what came before may remain just beyond easy reach. Today, new tools allow us to look for that evidence more carefully. Ground-penetrating radar can peer beneath layers of soil. Satellites and LiDAR scanning reveal hidden structures under forests and fields. Sonar maps see floors we could never see with the naked eye. In the Amazon, these technologies have uncovered traces of long-forgotten road systems and geometric earthworks concealed beneath centuries of jungle. In the Sahara, buried river channels and ghostly settlement patterns hint at an era when the desert was green and full of people. Each discovery forces us to adjust our picture of what early humans were capable of. The more we find, the more obvious it becomes that our understanding of the distant past is fragmentary at best. The ground under us is more than dirt. It's a layered archive. Each thin band of soil, sand, ash, or sediment is a page in a long, slow book about the earth and every creature that has walked across it. To read that book, we have to cultivate patience, the kind the planet itself has. Stone doesn't argue, sediment doesn't hurry. It simply settles and keeps its quiet record. Somewhere in that stillness may lie the evidence of worlds we've completely forgotten. So as we begin this extended wandering through the possibility of a civilization that predates what we call civilization, it's worth keeping one thought nearby. The clues may not look like what we expect, They may not be obvious temples or ornate tools. They might be patterns in magnetic anomalies, oddities in isotope ratios, or ancient stories that align too precisely with real events to dismiss as chance. Hints could be scattered everywhere, but they require a particular way of looking, not rushed, not overly certain, but gently attentive, like listening for a whisper muffled by long distances. The earth rarely tells its stories loudly. It speaks in shapes and shadows, in how mountains lean, in how particular stones are placed, in the way cultures far apart in space and time constructed monuments to the same points in the sky. Perhaps that isn't coincidence. Perhaps it's a kind of memory, the planet keeping its own past alive through us. As we travel further into this mystery, we'll follow those soft echoes through rock and sea, through legend and science, to face one of the simplest and hardest questions imaginable. If there truly was a first civilization, one before all the others, where did it go? And what, if anything, did it leave for us to find? For most of our recorded story, we've told ourselves that civilization began when we started scratching words into durable surfaces marks in wet clay in Mesopotamia, carved signs along the Nile, enigmatic symbols pressed into seals of the Indus Valley. Those early scripts became our milestone. This, we said, is when we truly became organized, imaginative, technological. But as we peer further back, that clean dividing line smudges. The boundary between prehistory and history grows hazy, more gradient than wall. Somewhere inside that blur may lie the faint outline of the vanished planners, the people who built, reasoned, and dreamed long before the timeline we've drawn for ourselves officially starts. When we talk about those possible ancient builders, we don't have to leap to extraterrestrials or literal gods. We might be talking about humans or beings extremely similar to us, who lived during the last ice age or perhaps even earlier. The biggest problem is not whether they could have existed, but how fantastic the erasing forces of ice and time really are. Imagine a city built 12,000 years ago, long before the pyramids, long before Sumer, long before the earliest writing. After a few centuries, its roofs sag and collapse, its streets crack, plants claw through pavements. Another few thousand years pass. Rivers shift and carve new channels through the area. Floods deposit fresh layers of silt. Forests engulf the ruins. Then ice advances or seas rise. Glaciers grind stone into powder. Sediments bury what's left. 10,000 years later, what remains? Perhaps only a scatter of worked stone in places where no natural bedrock should be, or suspiciously regular terraces on an otherwise untouched hillside, or a pattern of foundations so eroded they resemble random boulders. That is the sort of evidence we might expect. Not detailed blueprints or preserved machines, but puzzles etched into the very shape of the landscape. There are places in our world that stir that unsettling question more strongly than others. One of the most famous is the Great Sphinx of Giza. It has been examined and re-examined for centuries, yet parts of its story remain murky. Some geologists have proposed that the erosion on its body suggests prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall, rather than only to wind and sand conditions Egypt hasn't seen since the very end of the last ice age. If that interpretation is correct, it would imply that the Sphinx could be older than the civilization traditionally credited with carving it. Most Egyptologists remain cautious or skeptical, as they should. But even the possibility that one of our best-known monuments might predate its supposed culture raises an uneasy question. If this can be older than we thought, what else might be? Travel far to the northeast, to the high plains of Anatolia, and you encounter Göbekli Tepe, an archaeological quiet revolution. There, where gentle hills once were considered unremarkable, massive stone pillars rise from the soil in circular enclosures, like a world-size observatory or temple complex. The stones are decorated with animals, abstract signs, and precise geometry. Radiocarbon dates place the site at around 11,500 years old, long before conventional models expected such ambitious construction. Whoever built it had no cities, no pottery, no farms, according to our traditional narrative. Yet they organized labor, moved multi-ton stones, and carved detailed symbolic art. They gathered people for reasons that were clearly more than simple survival. Then there is the strangest detail. After centuries of use, Göbekli Tepe appears to have been deliberately buried. The people who built it carefully entombed their own work, as if closing a book. No clear explanation for why has yet emerged, and Göbekli Tepe is no longer a solitary anomaly. Similar, if smaller sites are being found scattered across the region. The more that emerge, the further back our sense of when complexity began has to stretch. The line between myth and archaeology, between what we considered impossible and what is now undeniable, grows thinner. Some researchers now suspect that the end of the Ice Age was not so much the dawn of civilization as its second sunrise lists a birth than a rebuilding. When we look worldwide at the earliest monumental ruins, patterns repeat. The smooth-sided pyramids of Egypt, the stepped pyramids and temples of Mesoamerica, the megalithic platforms and terraces of the Andes, the stone circles spread across Europe, the colossal statues of Easter Island. These are separated by oceans and enormous spans of time. Yet they share remarkable similarities. Pyramidal shapes, stepped forms, accurate alignments to the 4 cardinal directions, and an intense focus on astronomical events. The usual explanation is that humans everywhere share similar instincts. The triangle is stable. The sky is compelling. The sun's path is crucial for farming and navigation. Another possibility, though, is that knowledge traveled farther and survived longer than we once believed. Think of the extraordinarily precise stonework in parts of Peru, places like Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo. There, immense polygonal blocks fit together so tightly that even a thin blade won't slip between them. Each stone is irregular, yet they interlock like puzzle pieces without mortar. Transporting, shaping, and assembling such blocks would be challenging even with modern equipment. Some archaeologists attribute this feat to simple tools, ingenuity, and many patient years of trial and error. Others suspect methods we no longer fully grasp. Whatever the truth, the craftsmanship implies a deep and long-running tradition of skill, honed over generations. It hints at knowledge older than the surviving culture, possibly inherited from builders whose names and stories did not endure. We sometimes forget how delicate written history really is. Libraries burn. Scripts fall out of use. Entire languages vanish without a trace. Oral traditions wither when communities are scattered or suppressed. If a society doesn't record itself in a form robust enough to outlast war, climate, and neglect, it can fade almost completely within just a few centuries. That fragility makes the notion of a lost civilization less far-fetched. In the span of written history alone, we've watched empires emerge and vanish, leaving behind only fragments. The Indus Valley civilization built meticulously planned cities with advanced drainage systems and standardized bricks. Yet we haven't convincingly deciphered their script. We don't even know what they called themselves. If their memory can be so incomplete after only a few thousand years, what if something twice, 10 times, or 100 times older? In recent decades, explorations along the now submerged edges of continents have revealed intriguing signs. Off the coast of India, in places like the Gulf of Kambat, sonar surveys have mapped formations on the seafloor that resemble grids of streets and foundations. Artifacts recovered nearby have been tentatively dated to around 9,000 years ago, older than any known urban site on land in that region. Debate swirls around these findings. Are the shapes natural? Are the artifacts out of context? The evidence is not yet solid enough to redraw history. But if even one such underwater site turns out to be a genuine ancient city, it will change what we believe about when and where complex societies first appeared. Similar reports have surfaced near Japan, around the Bahamas, and in the Mediterranean submerged terraces, walls, and structures that faintly recall human design. Each alone is ambiguous. Together, they whisper a possibility. that much of humanity's earliest steps toward civilization happened along coastlines that are now underwater, erased from easy view when Ice Age seas rose. What makes these underwater hints compelling is the way they echo ancient myths. Across cultures, stories speak of a world destroyed and remade, an earlier age of greatness drowned, burned, or shaken apart. The Greeks told of Atlantis. Hindu texts describe cyclical ages, including a radiant golden age long in the past. Maya traditions speak of previous creations washed away. Aboriginal Australian stories recall flood events that detailed geological study has confirmed. The simplest interpretation is that these myths are poetic memories of real, localized disasters, floods, quakes, volcanic eruptions, magnified and reshaped over time. But it is also possible that they contain faint recollections of older centers of culture and knowledge that were destroyed by the dramatic changes at the end of the Ice Age. If survivors of those events carried fragments of their knowledge inland, they might have seeded the civilizations that we later recognize: Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, early China, pre-Columbian cultures in the Americas, the faint common patterns we see today. Similar symbols, shared architectural ideas, parallel mythic themes, could be the echoes of that dispersal. This could help explain why pyramid-like structures and sophisticated sky calendars appear on every inhabited continent, even among peoples who, according to our textbooks, never met. They may represent different local adaptations of some very old, very durable ideas passed down, reshaped, and partially forgotten. Yet, as we trace these patterns, we have to hold wonder and skepticism together. Science demands caution. Extraordinary claims require extraordinarily reliable evidence. Right now, we do not possess indisputable artifacts of a fully unknown civilization older than those we already acknowledge. That doesn't prove such a civilization never existed. It simply means that if it did, we have not yet found proof strong enough to convince the cautious mind. As our technology advances, scanning deeper beneath forests, ice, and ocean, we may reveal new chapters of this story. Until then, what matters most is the willingness to let evidence surprise us, to stay open when the Earth reveals something that doesn't quite fit our current expectations. Among the more curious clues are ancient maps. One of the most discussed is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. It appears to show parts of the coastlines of the Americas with surprising accuracy, and some interpret it as depicting a portion of Antarctica without ice, though that point is heavily debated. The map itself claims to be compiled from older charts, the remnants of earlier navigational records copied again and again. If any of those source maps truly originated in an age when coastlines looked significantly different, it would suggest that at least some geographical knowledge survived far longer than the civilizations that first produced it. It would mean that memory can travel across empires, languages, and collapses, preserved in skill and practice long after the original creators are forgotten. Knowledge often survives in fragments. Symbols reappear. Geometric ratios recur. Themes and stories echo each other across continents. The builders who cut and placed enormous stones or aligned their monuments with solstices and equinoxes may not have thought of themselves as pioneers. They might have believed, as we do, that they stood at the far end of an already ancient chain of understanding. To them, civilization might have already felt old. Perhaps they were looking backward too, remembering the others who came before them, just as we look back toward them now. That's what makes this possibility so intriguing. It isn't about proving a hidden global empire or discarding all of conventional history. It's about recognizing that our story may be deeper and more layered than we've assumed. Civilization might be less like a straight, ascending line and more like a tide coming in, pulling back and returning, each surge leaving faint, half-erased footprints on the shore. Somewhere under the next layer of sand or silt, the marks of those earlier steps might still linger. At quiet excavation sites, archaeologists sometimes speak, not publicly, but among themselves, of feeling a kind of presence. Not in a mystical sense, but as an awareness that their work connects them directly to other minds. When they hold a shard of pottery, a flaked blade, or a carved figurine, they feel the echo of the individual who made it, an unspoken greeting from thousands of years away. Now imagine that handshake reaching across 10, 20, 50,000 years. What would we feel in their grip? Familiarity, a sense of shared curiosity and problem solving, the same urge to build, to record, to understand, or something almost alien, suggesting that we are not simply their descendants, but their successors. One reason we may struggle to recognize any traces of a first civilization is that we are searching for ourselves in the past, for steel beams, glass towers, written alphabets, fossilized circuitry. But what if their civilization looked profoundly different? What if their mastery lay not in imposing themselves on nature, but in blending with it so well that their footprint was light? Perhaps their infrastructure was made mostly of organic materials. Perhaps their tools were delicate or bioengineered, leaving little trace. Perhaps their primary legacy was conceptual geometry, cosmology, ethics, rather than physical. A civilization could be deeply advanced in ways that don't mirror ours at all. It is possible that they understood the planet's system so intimately that they built with minimum waste, harmonizing with cycles rather than resisting them. In that case, the physical evidence might be vanishingly subtle, and that could be precisely why we have such difficulty finding it. In the end, this line of thinking draws us toward humility. We like to imagine ourselves as the pinnacle, the inevitable conclusion of everything that came before. But maybe we are just one more iteration in a much older pattern, another wave of builders, thinkers, storytellers reaching for understanding, each believing they are the first to do so. Somewhere in ruins still buried or worn almost smooth. Their fingerprints may remain in the way stones are arranged, in the myths we still tell about teachers and gods, in the star patterns reflected on the ground. As we continue this slow investigation, it helps to remember that what we call history is not a finished record. It's an ongoing conversation between the living and the dead, between what we can verify and what we can only infer. The vanished architects, if they existed, may not be fully gone. Their works may still shape our world in old alignments, persistent legends, and perhaps even in the restless urge that drives us to dig, to explore, to remember. If the earth does keep its memories, then every mountain, every submerged valley, every half-buried structure is part of a message written in very slow motion, a message we're only just learning how to read. Somewhere between rock and silence, between myth and measurement, we may still hear the faint echo of those earliest builders, saying in their own ancient way, "We were here." It's strange to think that stone can tell a story. It doesn't speak in words, it doesn't move or gesture or demand attention. And yet, when you stand before an ancient wall, a weathered carving, or a solitary pillar left in an empty field, there's a quiet sense that something is being communicated, not in sentences, but in arrangements. The way blocks are stacked, the directions they face, the sheer effort that must have gone into shaping and placing them, all of it adds up to a kind of message. Not about a single person, but about intention. Stone outlives memory, and that endurance turns it into a kind of storyteller. Every culture that has ever built in stone has done so, knowingly or not, to speak across generations, to whisper, "We existed. This mattered to us." Look around the globe, and that whisper becomes a chorus. Smooth pyramids in Egypt, stepped pyramids in Mexico, massive terraced platforms in Peru, stone circles in Britain, dolmens scattered across Korea, temple complexes rising out of Cambodian forests. Separated by oceans and ages, they somehow echo one another. They rise toward the sky, align with stars, greet the solstices and equinoxes with shafts of light, and follow geometry that feels too deliberate to be a coincidence. The repetition of these themes makes you wonder, did people in isolated corners of the world independently arrive at the same architectural and cosmic ideas? Or were they echoing something older, some shared inheritance of form and meaning? It's easy to separate myth and monument in our minds, to imagine stories on one side and stone on the other. But in many ancient cultures, they belong to the same narrative. In Mesoamerica, myths speak of gods descending in the vicinity of what are now pyramid complexes. In Egypt, temples were said to be earthly versions of heavenly structures, built according to divine blueprints. On Easter Island, the Moai statues were believed to embody ancestral spirits watching over the living. In prehistoric Europe, stone circles may have served as both ritual spaces and cosmic diagram stone calendars and compasses etched into the landscape. In each case, architecture is not just shelter or display, it's story made solid. Myth, in turn, is architecture made fluid in language. One preserves meaning in form, the other in words and performance. The more closely we examine these ancient structures, the more intricate they become. Many are aligned with extraordinary precision to celestial events. The sides of the Great Pyramid of Giza face almost exactly due north, south, east, and west, an alignment so accurate that it would challenge modern engineers without advanced instruments. At Stonehenge, the midsummer solstice sunrise shines into the heart of the stone circle. At Machu Picchu, the Intihuatana stone is positioned so that on specific days, the equinoxes, the sun cast shadows that seem to tie the stone to the sky, a literal hitching post for the sun in the Incan worldview. Across continents, ancient builders studied the sun, moon, and stars, and then wove those motions into stone. It's as though they wanted their structures to be read not only by human eyes, but by the heavens themselves. Why were they so captivated by the sky? On one level, the answer is practical. For early societies, the heavens were calendar, clock, and compass. The rising of certain stars signaled planting or harvesting seasons. The moon's phases guided rituals and timekeeping. The sun's path determined migration and construction cycles. But there is another, more subtle layer. The sky is the most obvious symbol of order we can see. When builders aligned temples and monuments with stars or solstices, they weren't simply marking time. They were affixing their work to the frame of the cosmos, stitching earth to sky through architecture. If the same patterns of alignment appear in cultures that had no direct contact, it may mean that the same cosmic blueprint was remembered and repeated, whether consciously or unconsciously, long after any original model was lost. Some researchers think myth itself may encode more than moral lessons, that it could function as a kind of data storage. Stories about gods chasing the sun might contain memories of seasonal changes. Tales of floods could preserve accounts of real inundations. Myths of shining cities sinking into the ocean might describe the loss of coastal settlements during ancient sea level rise. When you compare myths from different cultures side by side, their structural similarities can be striking. The same characters appear in different masks, the same events retold with local names and landscapes. It begins to sound less like coincidence and more like a shared memory, translated into different dialects of symbol and emotion. Take the constellation of Orion. It appears in the mythologies of Egypt, Greece, many parts of Africa, Australia, and the Americas. In Egypt, it was linked with Osiris, lord of the afterlife and resurrection. In other cultures, it's a hunter, a great ancestor, or a cosmic figure whose belt of 3 stars becomes a reference point in story and sky alike. On the ground, those same 3 stars seem to be echoed in the layout of the 3 largest pyramids at Giza. Similar triads show up in other ancient sites as well. Whether by careful design or intuitive mimicry, humanity has been mapping the heavens onto the earth for a very long time. If these correspondences are intentional, they might indicate that some early culture taught the principle, as above, so below, the idea that the arrangement of the sky should be reflected in how we shape the land. Stone remembers long after human language forgets. That's why archaeologists often speak of decoding rather than reading. The original meaning of a monument can shift dramatically even while its shape remains. A temple built for one purpose may be repurposed for another. A sacred site for one people may be adopted and reinterpreted by those who follow. Over time, layers of belief accumulate like sediment on bedrock. What starts as a direct commemoration of a celestial event, for instance, might become a ritual space for unrelated rites 6 centuries later. The structure is constant. The interpretation changes. When we gaze at ruins today, we're looking not only at what they were, but at everything they have been since. One of the most intriguing themes running through global mythology and architecture is the obsession with cycles, the rise and fall of worlds, the ages of humanity, the cosmic wheel of time. In Hindu cosmology, history moves through repeating yugas, golden, silver, bronze, and dark ages that roll over and over like seasons on an immense scale. Greek myth speaks of human ages in a similar descending order: gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each worse than the last. The Maya tracked vast cycles known as Baktuns, each marking a long epoch in their calendar, with creations and destructions repeating in grand loops. These frameworks may have arisen independently, but they share a central intuition: that history repeats, that nothing built is permanent, and that worlds have been made and remade many times. If a truly ancient civilization once existed, its memory might have survived not as a carefully dated historical account, but as a recurring motif. There was a time before ours, and it ended. The details would be woven into stories about gods, heroes, and cosmic battles. The pattern of rise, catastrophe, and rebirth would be the core truth carried forward. We can see how easily literal events morph into myth even today. A city destroyed by flood becomes a tale of divine punishment. A charismatic leader becomes a demigod in legend. A volcanically darkened sky becomes a story about the sun refusing to rise. Given enough generations, the sharp edges of history blur. Yet some seed of memory persists. When we listen to ancient tales about gods teaching people to plant crops, build walls, carve stone, or measure the heavens, we might be hearing faint echoes of real teachers, survivors of an older, more advanced culture, passing on their knowledge to people starting again. Language itself carries hints of deep connections. Words connected to stone, sky, light, and divinity often share common roots across far-flung cultures. Some linguists believe this points to very ancient contact, migration, and shared stories that predate the earliest written languages. If those words carried not just vocabulary, but myth, if they named the same stars, similar fears, the same awe in the face of the unknown, then our oldest surviving stories could be fragments of a global memory, faint but persistent, circling back in different forms. When archaeologists catalog ancient sites, they frequently encounter another motif: geometry. Circle, square, triangle, spiral, simple ratios like 1/2, 2.3, more mysterious ones like the golden ratio. These appear not only in monumental layouts but in carvings, pottery, and decorative motifs, from Europe and Africa to Asia and the Americas. Ancient builders seem to grasp that certain proportions feel harmonious. The ratio between the height and base of the Great Pyramid closely approximates pi. Agricultural terraces in some parts of South America follow patterns reminiscent of Fibonacci sequences, mirroring the spirals seen in seashells and plant growth. Prehistoric carving spirals, grids, interlocking patterns, echo mathematical motifs that reappear independently in distant cultures. Maybe people everywhere notice the same shapes in nature: the spiral of a shell, the curve of a seed head, the arc of the sun. Or perhaps they inherited a template, an old, well-tested aesthetic and structural language passed silently from one age to the next. This doesn't mean every mystery demands a lost civilization as an answer. Human imagination is vast. Given similar environments and similar senses, different cultures can arrive at comparable solutions independently. Yet the sense of connection is hard to entirely ignore. There's something deeply human about stacking stones toward the sky, mapping constellations in darkness, and telling stories to explain it all. In certain ways, mythology and architecture are the same art expressed through different mediums. Myths try to hold on to meaning. Monuments try to hold on to form. When they work together, when a story binds a structure to ritual and belief, memory becomes resilient. A temple with an active myth never truly dies. It remains part of the living world. That may be why some ruins feel more alive to us than others. The pyramids aren't just stone. They're symbols of ascension and eternity. The stepped towers of Mesopotamia aren't just platforms. They're stairways between heaven and earth. The temples of Angkor aren't simply buildings. They're stone maps of cosmic order, tied to myths of gods and kings. Wherever we look, story and stone reinforce each other. Each keeps the other from fading. Many ancient tales describe monumental works attributed to beings larger than life giants, gods, star people, or mysterious teachers who rose from the sea. These figures might be literal to those who told the stories, or they might be personifications of memory itself. When a culture forgets who really built something, it often explains that awe-inspiring structure by assigning its creation to greater than human powers. In that way, forgotten architects become divine. Over time, the gap between fact and story widens. We, looking back, may be tempted to dismiss such myths as simple superstition, but they may be an attempt to preserve the recognition that someone extraordinary did this, even when the details are lost. Imagine an age far in the future when our own cities are ruins. If the languages we speak now have long disappeared, whoever finds our crumbling skyscrapers might call them temples. They might think our radio towers were sacred spires. They might weave myths about sky beings who once lived inside glass mountains. They would invent stories to explain what they see just as we have. From that perspective, myth is not a lie. It's memory translated into symbol, holding on to truths too fragile to survive in literal form. If we follow these echoes as far as they'll go, we arrive at a question less about what was built and more about why. Building in stone is difficult. It requires enormous labor, resources, and a perspective that extends beyond one lifetime. Why invest such effort when wood and clay are much easier to work? Perhaps because they weren't building for themselves alone. They were building for the future, for whoever might stumble across those stones long after their names were gone. Stone is a form of time travel, a way of sending a message in the one medium we know can outlast language, governments, and memory: endurance itself. That endurance links us to those who came long before. When you walk among ancient ruins, you are moving through crystallized thought. Every block, every carving, every alignment is a piece of a silent sentence. The earth has carried these sentences through storms and eras, and they're still quietly speaking to anyone who chooses to listen. Somewhere inside those echoes in the carved myths and the unspoken mathematics, in the alignments we keep rediscovering, there may be the faintest traces of the very first builders. Not definitive proof, not perfect certainty, but presence. They might be the reason we keep doing what we do: building, telling stories, tracing patterns, searching. Because deep down, perhaps we're not only trying to learn who we are, but to remember who we once were. And as we follow those traces deeper, the trail begins to bend towards something subtler: the memory of the planet itself. The possibility that the Earth has been recording everything not just in stone and ruin, but in its own body in layers of rock, ice, sediment, and chemistry. If stone can speak, maybe the soil can remember. If that's true, then the next step in our search isn't upward toward the stars, or outward to the ruins, but inward, down, into the ground beneath us, where the earth keeps its oldest secrets in silence, waiting to be heard. If you could empty the oceans for just 1 hour and lay bare the world beneath, our map of human history would change in an instant. Under the dark water lie vast plains, winding river valleys, and entire mountain ranges that were once dry land. Somewhere on those drowned landscapes, tens of thousands of years ago, people may have walked, hunted, built, and told stories before the sea quietly crept in and erased their world. It's hard to remember that coastlines are not fixed. They shift in and out like a slow planetary breath, following the rhythm of ice and warmth. And somewhere in that long inhale and exhale, whole chapters of our story may have slid beneath the waves. The earliest civilizations we recognize grew along rivers and shores. Egypt rose with the Nile. Mesopotamia thrived between the Tigris and Euphrates. The Indus Valley civilization flourished along its river basin, and early Chinese cultures clung to the Yellow River. Water gave life, drinking, farming, transport. It also gave memory flood myths, sea gods, tales of lost lands. So when the great ice sheets melted at the end of the last ice age and the oceans rose, they didn't just swallow land. They may have swallowed some of our first attempts at living in complex, organized ways. At the peak of the last glacial period, the world was colder, drier, and heavier with ice. Massive ice sheets smothered large swaths of North America, Europe, and Asia, locking away so much water that sea levels were about 120 meters lower than today. That meant the continents extended far beyond their modern shorelines. Britain was not an island. It was connected to mainland Europe by a region we now call Doggerland. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Australia formed a single super landmass known as Sunda. Between Siberia and Alaska, where there is now the Bering Strait, a broad land bridge connected Asia and the Americas. Coastlines stretched hundreds of kilometers farther outward, forming fertile lowlands and gentle river plains where early humans would have found rich hunting, fishing, and shelter. When the climate warmed and the ice began to melt, the seas rose slowly at first. Then, in dramatic surges called meltwater pulses, in geological terms these were sudden, entire regions disappeared within the span of a few human lifetimes. Imagine living on one of those ancient coastal plains. Each year, the tide reaches a little farther inland. Over decades, you watch familiar sandbars vanish, hunting grounds become marsh, and then sea. The horizon creeps closer. What was once a distant line becomes a new shore. To those living through it, it would have felt like the end of the world. For many, it probably was. Those who fled inland probably carried their grief and fear with them, turned into stories about rising waters, angry gods, and drowning lands. Thousands of years later, those stories would be retold as myths. Now, as archaeologists and ocean scientists explore these drowned margins of the continents, the outlines of those lost worlds begin to re-emerge. The challenge is enormous. The ocean is vast, deep, often hostile. Light fades after a few dozen meters. Pressure crushes. Currents conceal. Yet with sonar mapping, underwater robots, and satellite measurements, we're starting to trace the shapes of those ancient coastlines. Off the coast of Japan, near Yonaguni Island, lies one of the most discussed underwater sites. About 25 meters below the surface, a massive stone formation rises from the seafloor, with terraces, broad steps, and flat platforms that look uncannily architectural. Some surfaces are sharply angled, others look like stairways or walls. The whole structure resembles a stepped pyramid, or ziggurat swallowed by the sea. Geologists are divided. Some argue that the formation is entirely natural, fractured sandstone shaped by currents and tectonic forces. Others see signs of deliberate modification, right angles, carved channels, and repeating shapes that hint at human hands. No final consensus exists. But regardless of its origin, Yonaguni reminds us how easily the boundary between natural and artificial becomes blurred underwater, and how little of that drowned world we truly understand. Farther west, off the coast of India, sonar scans in places like the Gulf of Khambat have revealed long linear features on the seabed that resemble the outlines of streets and buildings. Patterns stretch for kilometers, suggesting grids rather than random formations. Divers have brought up artifact stone tools, pottery shards that some studies date to around 9,000 years ago, older than any known city in that region on land. As always, there is debate. Some experts caution that the dating may be unreliable, or the artifacts may not be directly connected to the structures below. Others argue that, if confirmed, these finds could push the origins of urban life in South Asia back by millennia. Either way, the idea that people once lived in organized settlements along coastlines now underwater is no longer controversial. It's almost inevitable. In the Mediterranean, off Malta's coast, the sea conceals stone walls, terraces, and possible harbor works that appear to connect with megalithic temples still standing on land. It suggests that what is now seafloor was once bustling shoreline, later overwhelmed by rising waters. Submerged ruins near Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, the Bahamas, and even the coasts of northern Europe add to the list. Each discovery is incomplete and contested, but together they sketch a picture that the earliest phases of human sophistication may have grown up along shores now submerged. When we study the ocean floor, we don't just find ruins. We find traces of ancient landscapes, riverbeds carved into what is now seabed, ancient deltas frozen in sediment, and the ghostly contours of once dry valleys and hills. Off the eastern coast of North America, sonar mapping shows the channels of huge rivers that once flowed across the now submerged continental shelf. In the North Sea, scientists have reconstructed Doggerland, a low-lying stretch that once linked Britain and mainland Europe. For thousands of years, it held forests, lakes, and meadows full of animals and people. Then, around 8,000 years ago, as sea levels rose and a possible undersea landslide triggered massive waves in the North Atlantic, much of Doggerland was inundated in a geological instant. Fishermen still occasionally dredge up remnants from those old landscapes tools, bones and antlers caught in their nets, hints of a vanished everyday life now under the waves. For a long time, the prevailing idea was that civilization only emerged once the climate stabilized after the Ice Age, when agriculture could take hold. But what if the process started earlier, along those now drowned coasts? If early complex communities grew near the old shorelines, then most of their archaeological traces would be underwater, buried in mud and sand. We would only be catching glimpses around the edges. Beneath the seafloor itself lies another archive. Layers of sediment holding chemical traces of past climates, ecosystems, and perhaps even unexpected events. By driving long tubes into the seabed and pulling up cores of mud and sand, scientists can read these layers like a book. Grain by grain, they reconstruct temperature changes, salinity shifts, and carbon cycles across hundreds of thousands of years. In those cores, they find evidence of abrupt changes, sudden warming intervals, spikes in greenhouse gases, pulses of sediment marking massive floods. Some of these events match known ice sheet collapses and sea level jumps. Others remain less understood, standing as reminders that the Earth's water and climate are capable of swift, surprising shifts. In principle, if any technological civilization had existed before us, its industrial footprint might be detectable in such records. Unusual chemical signatures, synthetic compounds that nature doesn't produce, or strange isotopic ratios. This idea underpins the Silurian hypothesis, the thought experiment which suggests that we might only ever find traces of a truly ancient civilization as faint chemical blips in the geological record. So far, scientists haven't found convincing signs of anything like our own industrial activity in deep time. But the method, the way of looking, remains important. It highlights how easily a world full of technology can vanish almost without a trace, leaving only subtle fingerprints in mud and rock. Paradoxically, the sea, which erases so much, can also preserve. In its cold, dark depths, shipwrecks survive for centuries and even millennia. Entire harbors have been found buried in silt, their wooden posts still standing, their stonework intact. Pottery and tools can sit on the seafloor for ages, better preserved than they would be on land. Off the Greek coast at Pavlopetri, archaeologists have mapped an underwater town with streets, courtyard houses, and tombs dating back about 5,000 years. It's one of the oldest known submerged cities, a snapshot of life frozen by rising seas. If such examples exist within the range of known history, it's reasonable to suspect that older, deeper, and more eroded counterparts may lie beyond our current reach. Myths, perhaps more than objects, remember what the sea took. The world's folklore is crowded with tales of lands lost beneath the waves. Atlantis, Lyonesse, High Brazil, Kumari Kandam, Lemuria. The details differ, but the pattern is consistent. A prosperous, often wise civilization, destroyed by flood or oceanic catastrophe. Modern science tends to read these as metaphorical or as distant echoes of real geological events. Yet their persistence is striking. People across continents with no shared language or documented contact remembered water rising and reclaiming the world. Many languages root the word for sea or ocean in metaphors of motherhood or hunger, a vast cradle that both nourishes and devours. The sea feeds with fish and trade, but it also swallows ships, coasts, and sometimes entire ways of life. For early humans, watching the shoreline creep inland and drown familiar ground, the ocean must have seemed almost conscious in its power. Generations later, those memories became stories of gods shifting the boundaries between land and water. What makes the mystery beneath the waves so compelling is that it joins two enormous unknowns: the depths of human antiquity and the immense fluidity of the planet itself. We are realizing that civilization does not exist apart from Earth's rhythms. It rises and falls in step with ice, sea, and climate. If whole regions can vanish underwater in what amounts to a geological instant, then it's no wonder that our view of the distant past is incomplete. The ocean is both archive and eraser, keeping some things in remarkable detail and hiding others beyond our current reach. Researchers mapping submerged landscapes often speak of a peculiar feeling, seeing the shadow of an ancient river etched into the seafloor, or the outline of what was once an island, now far underwater. It's as if the planet still retains a faint memory of its earlier faces. Each new feature we map brings us closer to understanding not only where we came from, but how precarious our position really is. Our maps, cities, and borders depend on the illusion that coastlines stay put, that the ground beneath us is stable. But the sea, patient and persistent, reminds us that nothing remains fixed forever. If a first civilization did exist, the ocean would be its great tomb and its reluctant guardian. Its monuments would be buried under meters of silt, its metals corroded, its bones dissolved. What would endure might be only the most stubborn stones smoothed by time, and stories that transform the memory of rising water into myth. We may never reconstruct that world completely. We may find only fragments, a terrace where no terrace should be, a sunken wall just beyond a drowned river mouth, a legend that matches a known flood to an uncanny degree. But sometimes, fragments are enough. They don't give us a complete picture, but they do change the shape of the questions we ask about ourselves. The sea has always been both origin and ending for human stories. Life on Earth began in its depths. Trade and exploration spread across its surface, and given enough warming, it may reclaim much of what we now think of as permanent land. That thought isn't meant to be a threat. It's a reminder of scale. We are part of a pattern far older than any city, any nation, any temple. When the tides advance or retreat, they are rewriting coastlines the way they always have. And perhaps, somewhere beneath those waves, the remnants of an earlier chapter still lie intact, silent, dark, waiting for us to develop the tools and patience to listen through water and stone. If the earth keeps its memories, then the ocean is where it stores its most guarded secrets. We've barely begun reading the first pages. As we continue exploring these drowned worlds, tracing lost shorelines and submerged valleys, a new question rises quietly from the depths. If certain patterns keep repeating across time, across cultures, across the planet, maybe the clues left by that first civilization aren't random at all. Maybe they form a design, a kind of language written not on paper, but into the geometry of the earth itself. And that is where our next step leads into the patterns that, by all rights, shouldn't exist, but do. Everywhere you look on this planet, patterns appear where we wouldn't expect them. Circles, straight lines, alignments, and precise ratios show up across continents, cut into rock, traced in soil, and set into stone with a level of care that feels out of step with their supposed age. When researchers map these features, they often pause over the data, wondering how far coincidence can really stretch. How is it that so many of the world's oldest monuments line up with the movements of the sun, the path of the moon, and the positions of certain stars, sometimes even aligning with each other across vast distances despite being separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years? Perhaps it is simply human nature to seek order, to impose patterns on chaos. Or perhaps, woven into those alignments, there is something more deliberate, remnants of knowledge that survived long after the civilization that first discovered it fell silent. Patterns are the language of intelligence. We express ourselves in patterns whenever we plan a city, compose a song, design a tool, or map the sky. We recognize them in nature spirals and shells, symmetry in flowers, cycles in the seasons. Patterns are what make the universe intelligible. But some of the patterns found in ancient works hint at a grasp of mathematics, astronomy, and even global geography that doesn't comfortably fit the standard picture of primitive cultures. It's one thing to notice that the sun rises in a slightly different spot each morning, returning to the same positions at solstice and equinox. It's another to build enormous stone structures that track those positions with engineering-level precision. When such alignments pile up across different sites, the question shifts. It's no longer merely, did they notice these patterns? It becomes, where did they learn them? How long had they been watching? Consider again the pyramids of Egypt. Their bases are aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions north, south, east, and west, with an error margin so small that even some modern constructions struggle to match it. Achieving that alignment requires an intimate understanding of the Earth's rotation and a method of tracking true north that goes beyond casual observation. Remarkably similar care appears on the other side of the world. At Teotihuacan in Mexico, pyramids and avenues follow a layout that aligns with celestial events in certain geographic axes. The Pyramid of the Sun there sits at a latitude that, in relation to the equator, echoes the latitude of Giza in a mathematically suggestive way. The proportions of the complex bear intriguing parallels to those of Egyptian pyramids. The odds of two widely separated cultures without known contact arriving independently at such similar large-scale ratios and orientations purely by chance feel uncomfortably small. Then there are the numbers embedded in these structures. The ratio between the height of the Great Pyramid and the circumference of its base closely approximates the relationship between the Earth's radius and its circumference pi encoded in masonry. You can call that coincidence. Maybe it is, but it's one of many coincidences. Golden ratios appear in Greek temples. Harmonic spacing shows up in megalithic stone circles. Certain angular relationships keep recurring in South American terraces and sacred constructions. Ancient builders may not have written out formulas as we do, yet they consistently used relationships we now recognize as mathematical constants and harmonies. Across the world, from Cambodian jungles to the peaks of the Andes, old structures show alignments not only with the sun, but with stars whose positions in the sky have changed over millennia due to the slow wobble of Earth's axis precession. To align a monument with a particular star's position at a specific era, builders must either have observed the sky for very long periods or inherited records from those who did. In Egypt, internal shafts in the Great Pyramid once pointed toward the belt of Orion and the then pole star, not the one we use today. At Angkor Wat, the temple's layout appears to reflect the shape of the constellation Draco during an earlier epoch. In Mesoamerica, the Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza casts an undulating serpent-shaped shadow at the equinoxes, perfectly matching the myth of a celestial serpent descending to Earth. These alignments reflect a worldview in which Earth and sky are inseparable parts of one system. Architecture becomes a tool not only for shelter or worship, but for synchronizing human life with cosmic rhythms. Some patterns are geographic rather than celestial. When researchers draw great circle routes, the shortest paths over a sphere around the Earth, and plot certain ancient sites along them, they sometimes find unexpected alignments. A single great circle line has been drawn that passes near Giza, Easter Island, Machu Picchu, Mohenjo-Daro, Angkor, and other notable ancient sites. With enough points, patterns can always be found. But the possibility that ancient builders had some sense of the globe's curvature remains provocative. How could they have known? Perhaps by careful long-distance travel, by watching how stars shift with latitude, by comparing shadows cast at different locations. Or perhaps, if we allow ourselves to speculate, they inherited a fragment of global knowledge from an earlier culture that had already begun to map the world. Patterns appear in the dimensions as well. Certain numbers repeat across myths, monuments, and measures: 72, 108, 216, 432, and their multiples. In Hindu cosmology, a full cosmic cycle is said to last 4,120,000 years. The precessional cycle of Earth's axis, the time it takes to wobble through a full circle, is about 25,120 years, divisible by those same key numbers. Similar figures appear in Norse traditions, in Sumerian king lists, and in the spacing of stones at some megalithic sites. Are these repeating numbers mere human fascination with round figures? Or do they reflect an ancient awareness of celestial cycles encoded in myth and architecture to make that knowledge last? The mystery deepens when we turn to the precision of stonework. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, huge blocks of andesite, some weighing many tons, have been cut into intricate interlocking shapes with crisp right angles and smooth grooves that resemble the outputs of machining. The culture credited with these works, the Tiwanaku, had no metal tools harder than bronze, no written system that we know of, no wheels for transport in everyday use. Yet their stone forms display consistency, symmetry, and straightness that are difficult to achieve even with modern power tools. At nearby Sacsayhuaman, immense polygonal stones with irregular faces fit together so precisely that even a modern razor blade cannot be slid between them. Each block has been shaped so that it hooks into its neighbors, creating walls that have resisted earthquakes for centuries. No supernatural explanation is needed to admire this. Human ingenuity, deep experience, and trial and error can achieve astonishing things. But the question remains, how did so many different cultures, separated by oceans and time, converge on similar techniques, alignments, and mathematical signatures? It feels as if everyone was following the same faint blueprint, improvising around a shared set of principles that no one fully remembered, but many somehow felt. Some people see in these patterns the outline of a shared origin, the idea that, long before our known civilizations, there was a culture or interconnected set of cultures that discovered these principles and scattered them across the world. Others argue that convergent discovery is enough. Given similar skies, landscapes, and brains, humans will independently find the same truths. Both explanations have merits, but the possibility of a forgotten precursor civilization, a culture that mapped the stars, measured the earth, and embedded their discoveries in stone remains, one of archaeology's most haunting what-ifs. Strip away the speculation, and one fact remains. These monuments store data. They are stone libraries of astronomical and geometric knowledge. To build something that marks a solstice sunrise or a lunar standstill requires decades of observation at minimum. That suggests organized groups, stable communities, and long-term planning. These were not people blindly piling rocks. They were observers, mathematicians, and engineers in all but name, measuring time not in days, but in generations. The patterns don't end with architecture. They echo in myth as well. Floods wiping the slate clean, cities of light sinking into the sea, sky beings descending to teach writing, farming, and law, serpents coiled around sacred trees or stairways, guardians of hidden knowledge, heroes who die and return, mirroring the sun's nightly descent and morning rise. From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from northern Europe to southern Africa, these motifs recur. Anthropologists often see them as expressions of shared human psychology. That's one layer. Another layer may be memory recollections of real events and real teachers translated into symbolic language. If the same structures, ratios, and stories appear repeatedly in widely separated civilizations, we are seeing the fingerprints of something. Whether that something is a shared ancestral culture or simply the common patterning of the human mind, the result is the same. A web of similarity that stretches around the world. The difficulty in testing the first civilization hypothesis is time itself. The deeper into the past we look, the blurrier the record becomes. Rock cycles, sediment shifts, erosion, and plate tectonics continually recycle the Earth's surface. Anything older than a few 100,000 years has a very slim chance of leaving clear traces on the surface. If a civilization had flourished before the last ice age, most of its buildings would now lie under ocean or deeply buried, ground down, or transformed. We would be left not with intact cities, but with anomalies, patterns that don't quite fit natural explanations, alignments that feel too precise, and myths that sound suspiciously like recollections. In that sense, what we sometimes call unexplained architecture may be exactly what survives when almost everything else has been erased. The design outlives the designer. The pattern lingers even after the culture that created it is gone. Modern scientists have begun to tackle these questions with statistics. When they catalog the orientations of hundreds of stone circles, temples, and burial mounds, and then compare those orientations to the positions of the sun, moon, and stars, they find that alignments to significant celestial events occur far more often than random chance would predict. That suggests intention. That suggests people everywhere were trying to bind their structures to the sky, to stitch their fleeting lives to something enduring. These ancient observatories were more than calendars. They were bridges between human time and cosmic time, between the world of seasons and the slow turning of ages. Through them, people could feel connected to something larger than themselves, something rhythmical and trustworthy. When you step into one of those spaces at exactly the right moment, a solstice sunrise at a stone circle, an equinox sunset at a temple window, there's a sensation of being inside a machine that measures eternity. The stone, the light, the air, and your own presence suddenly feel coordinated, as if the monument has been waiting for that exact moment to function. Many such places also play with sound. Newgrange in Ireland, an ancient passage tomb aligned so that the winter solstice sun strikes its interior chamber, also magnifies certain frequencies, turning a human voice into a resonant vibration. Some South American pyramids produce peculiar echoes when you clap or call out, mimicking the calls of sacred animals. In Egypt and elsewhere, enclosed stone spaces hum when low tones are sung inside them. These acoustic effects feel intentional, as though the builders understood not just the geometry of light and shadow, but of resonance. Stone chambers become instruments. Sound becomes a tool for altering consciousness, perhaps for ritual, perhaps for something else we no longer fully grasp. Patterns extend beyond human works into the Earth's own physical quirks. Some ancient sites sit atop areas of unusual magnetism, fault lines, or geothermal activity. Whether by experimentation or intuition, many builders chose locations where the planet's own invisible forces are slightly different. Maybe they noticed that people felt strange or heightened in those places. Maybe they associated that feeling with the sacred. Or maybe, on some wordless level, they simply followed a sense that here is where this should stand. Patterns are seductive because once you see them, they are hard to unsee. The danger lies in forcing connections, in drawing lines between anything that vaguely fits. But the danger on the other side is to dismiss all patterns as coincidence and lose the chance to learn what they might actually reveal. Science advances by carefully testing patterns, by asking whether a perceived relationship is real or imagined. And so far, many of the patterns in ancient architecture and myth continue to resist simple dismissal. If a first civilization really once existed, doing the quiet work of mapping the heavens, measuring the earth, and encoding its discoveries into enduring forms, what we would expect to find today are exactly what we see. Faint echoes in geometry, recurring numerical motifs, alignments that seem to carry meaning. No single stone or story proves anything, but together they form something like a fingerprint, blurred, partial, but suggestive. Even with our satellites, supercomputers, and atomic clocks, we still lean on the same basic instincts as those ancient observers. We grid our cities, align our instruments, track cycles and seasons and skies. We map in angles and degrees. We search for universal constants. Perhaps that is the real inheritance left by whoever came first. The understanding that certain truths about reality are permanent, and that once any mind discovers them, they are never truly lost. They may be forgotten temporarily. They may vanish from scripts and schools. But they have a way of returning, because the universe itself keeps repeating them. As we continue following these patterns, they lead us toward an even more elusive record, not in monuments, but in the Earth's body itself. The rocks, the ice, the sediments, and the air hold memories that stretch far beyond the reach of any human archive. If a first civilization ever altered the planet in a way remotely comparable to how we are altering it now, those traces may still be faintly legible in chemistry, in isotopes, in the deep layers beneath our feet. The next step in this journey takes us into that hidden record, the memory of the Earth itself, where the story of any civilization, no matter how old, ultimately becomes part of the planet's quiet, layered autobiography. When we talk about memory, we usually imagine something fragile and personal, a face, a scent, a moment kept in the folds of the brain. But the Earth remembers too. It doesn't recall in images or sentences. It remembers in layers, in the thickness of rock, in the texture of soil, in the subtle mix of chemicals trapped in ice and mud. Every storm, every eruption, every forest, every creature leaves a trace. Over billions of years, those traces have been pressed into stone, buried in sediment, dissolved into oceans, frozen into glaciers. Together, they form the planet's memory, an intricate, unbroken record of change, written in the language of elements and time. If we can learn to read that language fully, we may find that the Earth has been quietly recording not just the age of dinosaurs, not just the drifting of continents and the rise and fall of seas, but also the impressions of intelligence ours, and any who might have come before. When geologists slice into a cliff or drill a core from the seabed, they're turning the pages of that memory. Each layer of sediment marks a span of time, years, decades, centuries, sometimes a single catastrophic event. Dust from deserts, ash from volcanoes, pollen from forests long vanished, tiny shells of plankton that once floated near the surface. All of it settles, accumulates, compresses, and waits. In Greenland and Antarctica, ice cores extend the story even further. Long cylinders of ice, some stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, hold air bubbles that are tiny fossils of ancient atmospheres. By analyzing them, scientists can see how much carbon dioxide and methane were present at different times, when the planet warmed or cooled, when fires raged, when oceans breathed more or less deeply. Occasionally, those frozen layers reveal something unexpected: sharp spikes in certain gases, traces of metals, or other anomalies that stand out from the steady background. Usually these have natural explanations: a massive volcanic eruption, a meteor impact, a sudden burst of wildfires. But a few researchers have begun asking a disquieting question: if a technological society had existed long before ours, would its presence show up in this record? And if so, what would we look for? That's the heart of the Silurian hypothesis. It doesn't claim that such a civilization actually existed. Instead, it asks how we would detect one, if it had. And in doing so, it reveals just how ephemeral our own imprint might be. The Earth is a relentless recycler. Crust is formed at mid-ocean ridges and destroyed in subduction zones. Mountains rise and erode away. Sediments are buried, heated, and transformed into new rock. Over millions of years, nearly every trace of surface activity disappears. If our industrial civilization ended tomorrow, then in a few million years, almost all visible evidence roads, buildings, bridges would be gone. What would remain is chemistry. When we burn fossil fuels, we change the ratio of carbon isotopes in the atmosphere, oceans, and soils. When we manufacture plastics and synthetic compounds, microscopic fragments of them settle into sediment. Our mining and industry redistribute rare elements, concentrating them in ways nature rarely does on its own. These changes are already visible in the geological record, a thin, distinct layer that future geologists, or future intelligences of any kind, would be able to detect. If a previous technological civilization existed millions of years ago, its legacy might look similar. A sudden shift in carbon isotopes, a layer enriched with unusual metals, or traces of molecules that shouldn't be there. Not intact machines, but their chemical shadows. So far, nothing in the deep record screams ancient industry. But our ability to read that record is still developing. We've sampled only a fraction of the Earth's sediments, and the further back we go, the more blurred the signal becomes. The rock record from hundreds of millions of years ago has been folded, metamorphosed, and partly lost. Any subtle traces from that far back would be extremely difficult to isolate. Still, thinking this way forces us to see our own era differently. The Anthropocene, the proposed geological epoch defined by human impact, becomes just a very thin band in the strata, a sharp chemical punctuation mark in Earth's autobiography. In 100,000 years, our cities may be gone, but that band will remain. The Earth's memory isn't limited to climate and chemistry. It also keeps track of upheavals. Across the continents, layers of ash, charcoal, and shattered rock speak of sudden disasters. Volcanic super eruptions, meteor impacts, continent-sized wildfires. These events often coincide with mass extinctions and abrupt shifts in ecosystems. One particularly puzzling interval is known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden cooling period that began roughly 12,800 years ago, just as the planet was warming and the last ice age seemed to be ending. For reasons still debated, global temperatures dropped quickly, glaciers stabilized or advanced, and climates shifted suddenly. Some evidence suggests this may have been triggered by a comet or meteor impact, or perhaps by massive meltwater pulses disrupting ocean currents. Whatever the cause, the Younger Dryas coincides eerily with the time frame of many flood legends and end-of-the-world stories around the globe. If an earlier, still fragile civilization were present at that time, it could have been severely disrupted, even erased, by such an event. Not necessarily wiped out completely, but knocked back to a point where surviving knowledge and infrastructure were scattered. The Earth's memory extends into the fabric of life itself. DNA is another record keeper. Every species carries within its genes the scars and triumphs of its lineage bottlenecks, expansions, migrations, and adaptations to changing climates and threats. Human DNA tells of a near-extinction event roughly 70,000 years ago, when our ancestors may have dwindled to a relatively small population, perhaps a few thousand individuals. A massive volcanic eruption, drastic climate change, or some combination of stresses may have triggered this bottleneck. If an advanced culture had existed among those earlier humans, a bottleneck of that sort could have obliterated it, leaving only a thin thread of survivors who remembered fragments but lacked resources to maintain their previous sophistication. Their descendants eventually, Use, would inherit a world reshaped, stripped of many traces of whatever came before. Geologists sometimes speak about Earth's history as if it were a heartbeat. Quiet stretches of relative stability, punctuated by abrupt spikes of crisis. Asteroid strikes, runaway greenhouse intervals, intense glaciations, and mass extinctions. Each spike is like a scar on the planet's memory, evidence of something that disrupted the usual rhythm. Some of these scars are clearly natural. Others are more ambiguous. If intelligence and technology recur, each bloom might leave behind just enough disturbance in the record to be noticeable, yet not enough to reveal the full story. The main obstacle to reading that story is time. The further back we look, the more the pages blur together. Rock layers buckle, minerals recrystallize, boundaries between events smear, whole regions of crust sink and are recycled into the mantle. Yet within this churn, certain fragments bypass destruction. Tiny zircon crystals, for instance, can survive for billions of years, preserving clues about early atmospheres and oceans. Within such fragments, scientists have detected signatures of when oxygen first began accumulating, when continents formed, when the planet cooled enough for stable crust to exist. These are the earliest pages of Earth's diary, hard to read, but still legible. If a technological civilization had ever existed in the truly deep past, we might someday notice it not by finding artifacts, but by spotting a strange anomaly in such ancient mineral records, a chemical combination that shouldn't be there, an isotope ratio that implies sudden, unnatural processes. We already look for such anomalies in the context of our own time. Our pollution, our nuclear tests, our alteration of nitrogen and phosphorus cycles through agriculture, these leaves marks. If future intelligence, reading the layers we're depositing now, would see a sudden, sharp departure from background behavior. That's what makes the Earth's memory both comforting and unsettling. It forgets almost everything, but not quite. Enough clues remain to tell us that change is the rule, not the exception. Life endures, adapts, and evolves. Intelligence, if it arises, is a pattern that might appear, vanish, and appear again. In that sense, civilizations are like coral reefs, intricate, vibrant, and fragile. Structures that emerge from the cooperation of countless small lives, flourish for a time, then crumble, becoming part of the foundation for whatever comes next. The more we learn to read the planet's archive in rocks, ice, genes, and sediments, the more we recognize that Earth itself is the continuity we've been searching for. It carries the memories of every era, every form of complexity, every spark of awareness. If there was a first civilization, the planet remembers it in its own way. Not as we would, with names and stories, but as rhythms, deviations, and chemical notes in a long symphony. Perhaps that rhythm is why certain ideas keep returning. Why geometry, harmony, and the urge to map the world appear over and over. Maybe we're not just inventing these things anew. Maybe we're rediscovering them, guided by a world that has already been shaped by such patterns once before. Where tectonic plates collide, the Earth's memory is almost visibly exposed. Folded layers of rock stand upright, like pages in a warped book. Some bands are smooth and uniform, markers of long stability. Others are jagged and chaotic, the record of sudden upheavals. To a trained geologist, those stripes are sentences. To most of us, they are only color and texture. Yet those same patterns, alternating layers, spirals, repeating motifs, are echoed in ancient art and architecture. It's as though the planet and its inhabitants speak a shared visual language of rhythm and repetition. Even deserts keep records. Beneath the sand of the Sahara, satellite images reveal fossil river systems, etched into the bedrock like veins. Once, the region was not endless dunes, but green savanna with lakes and flowing water. In some of those wetter periods, humans lived there in large numbers. Rock art on cave and canyon walls shows giraffes, crocodiles, hippos, and other animals now associated with much wetter climates. Deeper under the dunes, archaeologists are finding tools and carvings older than expected, remnants from phases of inhabitation long before the desert settled in. The sand remembers the rivers. The rock remembers the people. Oceans, too, maintain a quiet record. The thin layers of sediment at the bottom of deep basins accumulate slowly and evenly, trapping microscopic shells, bits of volcanic ash, dust from distant lands, and the remains of plankton blooms. Each layer is a snapshot of the planet's atmosphere and biosphere at a particular time. By examining the chemical composition of these microfossils and grains, scientists reconstruct temperature, oxygen levels, ocean acidity, even global wind patterns from thousands or millions of years ago. Somewhere in those layers, there might already be a signal we don't yet recognize. An unexplained spike in some compound. A strange mix of isotopes. A whisper of an event we don't have a name for. It could be natural. It could be something else. For now, it's just data waiting for interpretation. The planet's memory is vast, and we have only begun to decipher its handwriting. What stands out as we look deeper is how forgiving the Earth is. No matter what happens, impact, eruption, warming, ice, the planet rearranges, heals, and continues. Forests return in new forms, oceans cycle nutrients, life reinvents itself again and again. Even if a civilization burns itself out, the Earth doesn't hold a grudge. It folds that event into its story, smooths over the extremes, and lays the groundwork for new complexity. In geologic terms, a few thousand years of cities and machines barely registers a thin line, a momentary variation. Then the normal processes resume. This is likely why evidence of earlier worlds is so faint. Time sands down almost everything. Big scars become small anomalies. Great upheavals become subtle markers. Only the overall shape of the story remains. Yet shapes, once perceived, can be recognized even when details are gone. In a way, the Earth's memory is what ties us to any previous builders. It maintains the record of attempts, failures, and restarts. Every mine we dig, every fossil bed we uncover, every ice core we analyze is part of a conversation between epochs. We're reading what the planet has written, and at the same time, we're writing our own brief chapter into its layers. The Earth's record is not neutral in its effects, even if it is impartial in its accumulation. There are long stretches of equilibrium where climates and ecosystems remain relatively stable, and there are sharp corrections, mass extinctions, megafloods, sudden climate flips. These are the planet's editing marks, revising the narrative when it drifts too far from balance. Civilizations tend to emerge in the quieter intervals, when conditions are gentle enough for complex societies to form. They tend to falter or transform when those editing marks appear. If this rhythm has repeated for millions of years, then the memory of any first civilization might be buried under many rounds of revision. But like faded writing under newer ink, traces sometimes remain. We've begun developing tools specifically designed to detect such faint signals. High-precision isotope analysis, deep penetration radar, ever longer sediment cores, ancient DNA reconstruction, and more. Each technique translates another portion of the Earth's silent archive into human understanding. We're discovering that the planet records not just physical events, but something like emotional states as well. Stressed forests leave chemical markers. Coral reefs register trauma in their growth patterns. Soil structure reveals overuse or recovery. It's as if the Earth has been keeping track not just of what has happened, but of how intensely it was experienced by the biosphere. If a society once reshaped land through massive agriculture, cut down forests on a large scale, rewrote river courses, or altered the atmosphere, that activity would leave signatures in the planet's tissues. The Earth would remember, whether or not anyone else did. So the question becomes, if the Earth remembers everything, what is it telling us now? Maybe the message is that we are not unique, that others have walked this path of discovery and impact before. Or perhaps it's reminding us that forgetting is part of the cycle too, that the erasure of a civilization is not failure but transition, making room for something new. In a sense, our own search for ancient civilizations is part of how the planet remembers itself. When we dig, measure, and interpret, we're taking buried memories and bringing them back into awareness. We're giving voice to layers that can't speak on their own. Every fossil, every artifact, every chemical trace we identify is a sentence from the Earth's autobiography. Whether or not those sentences include a forgotten civilization, they tell us something profound. Nothing here truly disappears. It only changes form. Perhaps the first civilization, if it existed, understood that. Perhaps they saw themselves not as separate from the Earth, but as one way the planet had chosen to think about itself for a while. They might have realized that the real monument isn't structures of stone or metal, but the influence they leave embedded in the world's patterns of balance, of knowledge, of harmony. The soil beneath our feet may still carry some imprint of their choices, not as ruins we can photograph, but as subtle orders in ecosystems, as a faint rhythm of equilibrium that we sense when we live in, step with nature, and feel when we stray too far. As we attune ourselves to that rhythm, the path forward grows clearer. If the planet keeps its deepest memories in stone and sediment, then the stories of those who came before us may also be preserved in another archive, human story itself. Legends might be our species' version of sedimentary layers, emotional and symbolic deposits of events long past. When science and myth finally meet, they may show us that some of our oldest tales are translations of geological memory into human words. And when those two forms of memory overlap, we might begin to recognize something hidden between them. Every culture carries its own story about how the world began and how it ended once before. These tales speak of floods and fires, of cities that disappeared, of teachers who descended from the sky or rose from the sea to rebuild what was lost. For a long time, such stories were treated as pure invention moral lessons or imaginative attempts to explain natural phenomena. Yet as our scientific understanding deepens, an odd thing happens. Some of those old tales start to sound less like fantasy and more like distorted, but persistent memory. Myth and science speak different tongues. Science works in measurements, tests, and repeatable results. Myth speaks in symbols, archetypes, and emotional truth. But both are attempts to describe the same reality. One external, one internal. When we listen carefully to what the oldest stories are actually saying, we often find that they're describing geological, climatic, or astronomical events in language early humans could grasp. For centuries, scholars brushed off the nearly universal flood legends as symbolic cleansings or moral parables. Almost every ancient society has some version of a world-spanning deluge, a disaster that swept away an earlier age and left only a handful of survivors to start again. Then, in the late 20th century, geology confirmed what the rocks and sediments had been hinting at. As the last ice age ended, sea levels rose more than 100 meters. Glacial lakes burst their icy dams, sending torrents of water scouring across continents. Coastlines retreated, lowlands drowned, rivers carved new paths overnight. In the Pacific Northwest, in regions around the Caspian and Black Seas, and in other parts of the world, evidence points to immense flooding events, water surging across landscapes with a force no human could have resisted. To those who lived through them, it would have felt like the world itself was being remade. If your ancestors survived such a cataclysm, your descendants would remember. They might speak of divine judgment, a purifying flood, a reset of the world. The details would change in retelling, but the core memory, sudden, overwhelming water would endure. In Mesopotamia, the story of Utnapishtim, later echoed in the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes a great flood that nearly eradicated humanity, with a single man building a vessel at the god's command. This narrative predates the biblical Noah by centuries, yet the parallels are striking. The ship, the animals, the birds sent out to find land, the final resting on a mountain. In India, ancient texts tell of Manu, warned by a divine fish of an impending flood and instructed to build a boat. In Greece, Deucalion survives a deluge sent by Zeus and repopulates the world. In China, Yu the Great labors to tame catastrophic waters. Among indigenous peoples in the Americas and Australia, stories describe the sea rising, coastlines vanishing, and only those who fled to high ground surviving. These myths, separated by oceans and languages, share a common pattern that closely resembles what we know happened as ice retreated and seas surged into river valleys and continental shelves. When modern science finally confirmed that water had indeed reshaped the world in dramatic ways around 12,000 years ago, myth and geology quietly aligned. One had preserved the emotion and narrative of the event. The other preserved its physical traces. That realization opened a door. If flood myths derived, at least in part, from real experiences of sea level rise and catastrophic inundation, what other myths might also encode genuine memories? Volcanic eruptions, for instance, have long been associated with gods who dwell beneath mountains. Hephaestus in Greek myth, Pele in Hawaiian tradition, Kagutsuchi in Japanese tales. Stories of angry deities hurling fire and ash match. What happens when a volcano erupts violently? When archaeologists dated major eruptions near cultures that told such stories, they often found that the first appearance of the myth corresponded roughly to the time of the real event. Those who saw mountains explode and skies darken did not forget. They turn terror into story. Celestial myths also tend to carry unexpectedly accurate details. Aboriginal Australians have star stories that map constellations to seasonal changes, hunting cycles, and even distant geographical features. Maori navigators in the Pacific encoded entire star charts into chants and legends, using them to voyage across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. The Maya tracked the cycles of Venus and other planets with extraordinary precision, embedding their patterns into myths of gods and cosmic serpents. Greek tales of Orion, Perseus, and Andromeda describe constellations exactly as they appeared in the sky at specific historical periods. When astronomers model the ancient heavens with software, they find that some myths effectively function as poetic, time-stamped sky maps. Then there are the stories of lands that vanished, Atlantis, Lemuria, and their many lesser-known cousins. Plato's account of Atlantis is the most famous, but similar tales existed worldwide long before and long after him. Island realms destroyed by the sea, prosperous regions swallowed by the ocean, advanced societies undone by catastrophe. For a long time, these were regarded as allegories or philosophical fables. But modern geology has revealed that many coastal and island regions were indeed drowned as ice melted and the seas rose. The Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, the Caribbean Basin, parts of the North Atlantic. These were once larger lands with shorelines far beyond their present boundaries. When the water moved in, those lands were reduced or erased. Those who lived there either perished or migrated inland, carrying memories of the world that was before. In myth, those memories transformed into stories of lost continents and sunken kingdoms. Of course, not every legend lines up neatly with a geological event. Myths are layered. New meanings are added over time. Stories combine and evolve. But the pattern remains. Myth frequently preserves the emotional outline of real experiences, especially disasters. Far longer than physical evidence can survive on the surface. In oral cultures, story is more than entertainment. It's a storage system. A tale about a serpent in a river might encode knowledge of dangerous currents or seasonal floods. A myth about a star god might preserve the timing of a critical constellation's rising. A narrative about a golden age destroyed could be a distant echo of a time of climatic stability ending abruptly. Modern researchers have begun to systematically compare myths with environmental and geological data. In Australia, some indigenous flood stories preserve the memory of coastlines, as they looked 10,000 years ago, before sea levels rose to their present mark. These stories describe islands that no longer exist and shorelines now deep underwater, with a degree of accuracy that suggests an unbroken chain of oral traditions stretching across hundreds of generations. Similarly, Polynesian navigation chants encode detailed information about star positions, wind patterns, and currents. When anthropologists combined these oral maps with modern GPS and oceanography, they found that many of the routes were remarkably precise. These myths weren't just stories, they were living atlases. This blending of myth and data isn't a return to superstition. It's a recognition that knowledge has many containers, and that story can carry practical information wrapped in symbol and metaphor. What happens when myth and science start to meet? Something more interesting than simple confirmation or contradiction. They begin to inform each other. Scientists consult local legends when searching for lost cities or ancient impact craters. Archaeologists investigate sites that elders describe in story, sometimes finding ruins right where the tales said they would be. Myths become clues, not proof, but powerful hints about where to look. At the same time, scientific discoveries give new depth to old stories. When we learn that a great flood really did sweep through a valley, the local flood myth suddenly feels less like a moral fable and more like a people's emotional archive and eyewitness account, retold in a form that outlasted stone. Sometimes the parallels are uncanny. Certain myths mention star positions or astronomical alignments that correspond to skies as they looked tens of thousands of years ago, much earlier than the culture's recorded history. Egyptian myths of Osiris and Isis, for example, parallel the relationship between Orion and Sirius. Some interpretations suggest these narratives may preserve memories of star positions from epochs before dynastic Egypt, though that remains controversial. In the Andes, the Inca spoke of Viracocha, a bearded god who emerged after a great flood to teach people agriculture, building, and cosmology. In Mesopotamia, the figure of Oan's half-man, half-fish emerged from the sea to instruct humans in law and writing. The names change, but the pattern is familiar. Knowledge bringers arriving in the aftermath of catastrophe to restart civilization. Perhaps these figures are simply personifications of culture and learning. Mythic embodiments of the idea that civilization feels like a gift from beyond ordinary experience. Or perhaps they are distant memories of real individuals or group survivors from devastated regions who carried advanced skills into places where people were starting again. Myth tends to preserve the emotional truth of events, even as it distorts the literal details. That might be why certain motifs are so persistent. The flood that resets the world. The golden age that fell. The teacher who comes from the sea or sky. The star that guides. These images echo across continents as if they were part of a shared human dream or a shared human memory. Some scientists are understandably wary of drawing too much from myth. The risk of reading our own desires into old tales is high, yet it's also true that myth has guided real discoveries. The ruins of Troy, the palace at Knossos, meteor impact craters linked to indigenous stories of fire from the sky. Perhaps the most balanced perspective is this: myth and geology, myth and archaeology. These are not enemies. They are different ways of remembering. The earth records events in stone and chemistry. People record them in images and narrative. When those two records align, even partly, we have a better chance of seeing the whole picture. If there was a first civilization, a culture that rose, flourished, and collapsed long before our earliest written texts, its memory might not rest in intact cities or written archives. It might be hidden in resilient mythic patterns that no amount of time could quite erase. Over millennia, details would fade, names would change, locations would drift. But the core story, a world before this one, destroyed by disaster, followed by teachers and rebuilders, would persist. Atlantis may be only one retelling of that older pattern, a symbol that stands in for every civilization the planet has lost. As we continue to compare myth with measurement, we might find that our oldest stories contain more than echoes of fear and hope. They might also hold fragments of instruction knowledge abstracted into narrative, so that it could survive collapses, migrations, and forgetfulness. In that light, those ancient builders and storytellers were not just preserving memory. They might have been sending guidance forward, encoded in forms that could be remembered long after their languages and cities were gone. So the next question becomes, if myths do carry such fragments, what are they trying to tell us? What ideas were considered so important that they had to be hidden in story? Perhaps embedded in those tales of lost worlds and wise teachers are blueprints, not for machines, but for ways of living, building, and thinking. To find them, we have to read myth and evidence together. We have to let science and story hold the same object from different sides, illuminating each other. And when we do, we may begin to glimpse the outlines of minds long vanished, still speaking to us from beneath the layers of time. If myths truly preserve fragments of ancient memory, then another question quietly takes shape. What else might they contain besides stories of catastrophe and rebirth? Could they hold instructions, distilled wisdom intended to survive even when everything else falls apart? If a civilization knew it would one day vanish and understood how fragile libraries and monuments are, it might choose to encode its most important insights in a form that endures best in human culture: story and symbol. Not facts, which can be forgotten or mistranslated, but patterns of meaning woven into epic tales, rituals, and images. To explore that possibility, we have to look at more than what myths say. We have to look at what ancient builders did at the engineering, astronomy, and hidden logic embedded in their structures. The more we examine the ruins of the ancient world, the less they feel like crude beginnings, and the more they resemble riddles. They're too precise, too durable, too carefully placed to match the simplistic idea of primitive builders just stacking stones. According to the timelines we've drawn, some of these works shouldn't exist in their current form at the time they appear. That tension gives the central question a new weight. Not only who built this, or why, but how. The word how carries centuries of quiet bewilderment. How did people move stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons without cranes or engines? How did they cut and smooth granite and basalt with edges as clean as modern machine work, using only copper tools and stone hammers, or so we assume? How did they design structures with tolerances so tight and alignments so accurate that even modern engineers hesitate to reproduce them on the same scale? Attempts at answers have ranged from the purely mythic gods and giants to the purely mechanical. Ramps, rollers, teams of laborers, primitive surveying. Some explanations may be correct, at least in part. But as evidence accumulates, the puzzle seems to deepen rather than shrink. Each new precise cut, each uncanny alignment hints at a level of understanding that feels advanced for the cultures we associate with those works. One way to reconcile this is simple. We've underestimated ancient people. They were smarter, more coordinated, more innovative than we've given them credit for. That's certainly true. Another possibility is that some of the techniques they used were inherited from prior traditions, refined and passed down from teachers whose names were forgotten. Forgotten engineers doesn't have to mean extraterrestrials. It can mean human beings, just like us, who grasped principles of physics, architecture, and nature more deeply than their successors did for a time. Civilization isn't a permanent ascent. It's a series of rises and falls. Knowledge builds, hits a peak, and then, under the pressures of disaster or decline, fragments. The next cycle starts from what's left. The first engineers in this sense would be those who first conceived of the earth as a thing that could be shaped with intention, not just farmed or hunted, but sculpted in a way that would last. Walk through Baalbek in Lebanon, and you feel that intention immediately. The temple complex there rests on a foundation formed from mammoth blocks of stone. Some of these megaliths weigh over 1,000 tons. One, the famous Stone of the Pregnant Woman, still lies partially detached in its quarry, as if abandoned mid-project. Even with modern machinery, moving such stones intact is a logistical nightmare. Yet someone, long ago, not only carved them but set many of them in place with astonishing accuracy. The later Romans constructed temples on top of this older stone platform, but their blocks are smaller. Their engineering clearly adapted to what was already there. It's as if they respected the foundation stones as relics of a deeper past, beyond even their skill something to build upon, not replicate. Similar scenes appear around the world. In Egypt, the granite blocks of the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid are fitted so precisely that paper can barely slide between them. In Peru, at Sacsayhuaman, irregular stones fit together with complex curves and angles, creating earthquake-resistant walls that still stand after centuries of tremors. At Pumapunku, those enigmatic andesite blocks with carved grooves, interlocking notches, and sharp right angles suggest at minimum a highly systematic building method, one that required consistency of measurement, specialized skills, and sophisticated planning. In India, the stepwells of Gujarat descend into the earth in dizzying geometric spirals, intricate patterns of stairs and landings cut deep into the ground, designed to access water even as levels rose and fell. They are both beautiful and functional, works of art and hydraulics combined. In Cambodia, Angkor Wat's temple complex is built from massive sandstone blocks transported from miles away, fitted with such precision that mortar was unnecessary. Its towers are arranged in a layout that mirrors star patterns, and its causeways and galleries encode cycles of time in their proportions. Each of these examples reflects more than brute force. They embody a refined understanding of weight, stress, weathering, water flow, and movement of the ground. Many are built in regions prone to earthquakes, yet their designs anticipate and mitigate that danger through flexible masonry and interlocking shapes. The same structural ideas appear in distant places. Polygonal blocks that lock together in Peru and Japan. Layered construction that allows shock absorption in both Incan walls and certain ancient Mediterranean sites. That doesn't prove a direct connection, but it does suggest that certain principles of building ways of making structures collaborate with a restless planet have emerged, vanished, and re-emerged multiple times. Another layer of sophistication is acoustic. Many ancient temples and chambers amplify or shape sound in deliberate ways. The Hypogeum of Halsaflieni in Malta, a subterranean complex over 5,000 years old, resonates at frequencies that produce measurable physical effects in the human body, altering brainwaves, intensifying emotional responses, and creating sensations of vibration in the chest. At Chichen Itza in Mexico, a hand clap in front of the Temple of Kukulkan produces an echo that sounds like the call of the sacred Quetzal bird. The effect depends on the precise geometry of the stairway and platform, tuned accidentally or intentionally, to transform a simple noise into a symbolic voice. Ancient Egyptian chambers, Incan walls, Greek theaters, and other structures around the world show similar acoustic sensitivities. Sounds focus, reverberate, or dampen in ways that suggest careful experimentation and an awareness of how architecture can influence experience. Where are the tools that produce such works? That is one of the enduring puzzles. We find copper chisels and stone hammers near some quarries in Egypt, and it is assumed that all stonework was achieved with such tools. Yet granite and diorite are far harder than copper. To create smooth, flat faces and straight cuts in such materials with soft chisels would be a monumental task, dulling tools almost instantly. In some cases, we see evidence of deep, straight boreholes and curved cuts that resemble what rotary drills would produce. The grooves and striations on certain artifacts hint at techniques that go beyond simple pounding and grinding. None of this proves lost high technology, but it does suggest that ancient craftspeople might have used methods or materials we haven't fully reconstructed. Combinations of abrasive techniques, leverage, heat, and possibly even sound or vibration. Modern experiments with acoustic levitation, ultrasound cutting, and other non-traditional methods show that it's possible to move and shape materials in ways that leave surprisingly subtle traces. It's not unreasonable to imagine that earlier cultures might have discovered simpler versions of such effects, then lost them during periods of collapse. Ancient engineering also displays an unexpected grasp of geography and astronomy. Alignments to solstices and equinoxes are common enough, but some sites go further, encoding not just positions of the sun and moon, but long-term cycles like precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. Those who designed Giza seem to have aligned the pyramids with star positions corresponding to an era older than the conventional dating of the structures themselves. Some researchers argue that the layout mirrors Orion's belt, and that the Nile corresponds symbolically to the Milky Way, a cosmic map in stone. Elsewhere we find similar correspondences, temples that reflect the shapes of constellations, complexes that mark the rising of particular stars at key moments in long cycles, monuments that appear to track not only the year, but changes in skies over thousands of years. In many myths, knowledge is said to be handed down by special figures, gods, sages, culture heroes, or semi-divine architects. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, the Egyptians of Thoth, the Maya of Kukulkan, the Inca of Viracocha. Each culture credits such beings with bringing writing, agriculture, astronomy, and laws, arriving suddenly with advanced knowledge where none existed before. Perhaps these are simply stories personifying the birth of civilization, or perhaps they are distant recollections of actual groups of people survivors from older societies who appeared among more scattered populations, carrying with them fragments of techniques and understanding. Seen this way, what we call the beginning of civilization might actually be a reboot, a reassembly of older methods and ideas in a new context. The forgotten engineers wouldn't be mythical giants, but real craftspeople and thinkers whose legacies were partly preserved, partly mythologized, and largely misattributed to gods. In our own history, we've watched specialized knowledge disappear when the conditions that sustain it are broken. The formulas for Roman concrete, capable of self-healing through slow crystal growth, were largely lost for centuries. The secrets of Damascus steel faded. The precise recipe for Greek fire vanished. These were relatively recent technologies, lost in a span of mere centuries due to wars, shifting priorities, and the deaths of a few key artisans. Multiply that loss by global catastrophe, extended over thousands of years, and entire sciences could evaporate. If the first engineers existed long before our known civilizations, their tools might have been simple but their understanding subtle. They may have mastered principles of acoustics, vibration, load distribution, and environmental harmony that were passed down in rituals and rules of thumb rather than written formulas. Their influence could persist in design without their names enduring. There's another, quieter possibility. Perhaps their technology didn't resemble our mechanical bias at all. Maybe it was based on working with natural forces instead of fighting them. They might have understood resonance, magnetism, and living systems so well that they could guide growth, shape materials gently, and design environments that maintained themselves. Such methods would leave far fewer junk piles and broken machines. Their ruins might look less like junkyards and more like strangely perfect pieces of natural stone, or well-balanced landscapes. Modern science is just beginning to explore methods like low-energy shaping, sound-based manipulation of matter, and bioengineering that lets organisms do much of the work. It's conceivable that past minds, following different paths, may have reached their own versions and left almost nothing obvious behind. If we could speak with those early engineers now, they might tell us that the true high technology is not what conquers nature, but what collaborates with it, leaving the smallest scar for the greatest effect. We tend to imagine progress as a rising line that leads inevitably to us, but maybe it's more like a spiral, revisiting the same themes in different forms. Perhaps the forgotten engineers were not the first, but merely one iteration in a repeating pattern of emergence, discovery, and loss. Future civilizations might stand among our ruins, asking the same questions we ask of theirs. How did they do this? Why did they build this way? What did they know that we don't? Even now, echoes of their work may persist underfoot in stones that resist time, in walls that still hum with certain frequencies, in layouts that keep aligning mysteriously with stars. Every such structure is a faint message across time. Intelligence was here. Questions were asked, solutions were found. We may never uncover the full blueprint, but by studying their surviving works, we're doing more than solving engineering mysteries. We're learning, slowly, how to re-enter the dialogue they began with the earth, with the sky, with the patterns that tie both together. Their greatest lesson might not be in any specific method, but in their overall philosophy. That building is a relationship, not just a project. That durability comes from harmony with the environment, not defiance of it. And if they truly foresaw that their world would end, they may have done something even more remarkable than their stonework. They may have tried to leave a message intended not for their contemporaries, but for us. A message not written in words, but encoded in geometry, proportions, and alignments, waiting for a future civilization to become advanced enough and curious enough to understand. As our tools sharpen and our patience grows, we may discover that the ancient builders were not only constructing temples and tombs, they were also building sentences in a language that time cannot erase, a language meant to be read by whoever came next. If you wanted to send a message far into the future, not 50 or 100 years, but thousands or tens of thousands, what medium would you choose? Paper crumbles. Digital files vanish with power and hardware. Metal corrodes. Even orbiting satellites will eventually fall or drift into darkness. Languages evolve. Symbols lose their meaning. What remains? Stone. Geometry. The sky overhead. The shape of the earth beneath. If a truly ancient civilization foresaw its own decline, it might have realized that its books and devices would not last. But it could choose to speak in more durable forms, proportions that never change, alignments that outlive empires, patterns that any later intelligence could recognize, no matter what language it speaks. Perhaps that's why the oldest monuments focus so obsessively on the same things: the cardinal directions, the solstices and equinoxes, long astronomical cycles, and specific ratios that reflect fundamental constants of our world. Across cultures, these structures repeat a kind of refrain: pay attention to the sky, pay attention to cycles, pay attention to balance. The Great Pyramid is oriented so precisely to true north that its deviation is less than a fraction of a degree. The temples of Mesoamerica mark the sun's passage with staircases and shadows. Stone circles frame sunrise and sunset at key moments of the year. These are not random aesthetic choices. They are measurements turned into architecture. Every alignment and ratio is a line of information, a fragment of a message. We understood this. We thought it mattered enough to carve into rock. Some researchers see ancient sites not as isolated achievements, but as nodes in a planetary scale design. The Nazca lines in Peru, for instance, vast geoglyphs etched into the desert form straight lines, geometric shapes, and animal figures that stretch for kilometers. They are best seen from the sky, yet were built by people with no known aircraft. One interpretation is that they were offerings to gods in the heavens. Another is that their scale and simplicity were chosen precisely because they endure. Wind and time can blur a statue, but a shallow trench in a desert plateau can last for millennia, its meaning waiting for anyone with a high enough vantage point, whether a god, a pilot, or a satellite. Similar questions arise at other sites. Why monuments that can be seen from far away or above? Why layouts that become meaningful only on large scales? Perhaps they were meant to be recognized later, when technology returned to the point where we could rise above the ground and see patterns that are invisible from eye level. Even at the ground scale, many complexes seem to function like books written in architecture. Temple courtyards and galleries encode cycles of time in their counts of columns or steps. Measurements correspond to planetary periods or precessional ages. The Great Pyramid's internal passages have been interpreted by some as mapping out intervals of time or astronomical distances in their dimensions. Whether or not every such claim is correct, the overarching idea is compelling. Knowledge embedded in form. If you want information to survive beyond language and beyond your culture, you bind it to math and physics, the only vocabulary you can be sure future minds will share. We do something similar with our own attempts at long-distance communication. The Voyager spacecraft each carry a golden record with etched diagrams, the position of our solar system relative to pulsars, the structure of the hydrogen atom, basic units of time and distance. These are not human words, but universal references. Any technologically capable intelligence, the designers assume, could eventually decode them. Now imagine a civilization doing the equivalent not in space, but on Earth, using stone instead of gold and cosmic alignments instead of etched diagrams. They might encode the circumference of the planet in the dimensions of a monument, the ratio of Earth's orbital period to the moon's in the layout of a temple, or precessional cycles in the orientation of long corridors. Some of this may well be coincidence, but the recurrence of certain key ratios and cycles in ancient architecture is difficult to ignore. It suggests that at least some builders were thinking in terms of planetary and cosmic constants, not just local concerns. In many places, architecture, myth, and mathematics weave together into a single system. The Mayan long count calendar tracks vast cycles of thousands of years, and their temples align with events that mark those cycles in the sky. The Vedic texts of India embed astronomical data in numerical patterns and stories. Angkor Wat's layout has been interpreted as reflecting both the Hindu cosmos and long cycles of time, with specific structures corresponding to yugas, vast ages that repeat. In Egypt, the Sphinx gazes toward the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the equinoxes. Its orientation and associated star lore suggest possible links to the precessional cycle, the slow shift of the zodiac over roughly 26,000 years. Taken together, such elements hint at a preoccupation with time on a scale far beyond individual lifetimes or even the lifespan of dynasties. It's as though the builders were trying to mark the turning of great cosmic gears and to leave a calendar that would remain legible even after their own cultures faded. If you wanted to warn future generations about recurring disasters tied to these cycles, say, periods of increased comet activity or climate instability, you might encode those warnings in this kind of architecture. When the sun rises here, in this constellation, the monument might be saying, "We approached danger before. Pay attention." Of course, we don't have a clear key to such a code. But even the possibility changes how we look at these structures. They cease to be merely relics of forgotten religion and become potentially functional devices, machines made of stone, designed to survive upheaval and restart conversations about the heavens. There's also the question of who these messages were meant for. Myths often say monuments were built for the gods or for the dead. But from another perspective, gods might simply mean those who exist beyond our current understanding, which can include future humans. Perhaps the builders understood that their world would not last forever. Their writings might burn, their libraries might wash away. But certain forms-aligned stones, carefully proportioned distances, could endure long enough to be read by whoever came next. In that sense, every major monument becomes a letter addressed to unknown recipients, to whatever minds follow us. Such a message would not be obvious. It might be deliberately subtle, so that only a civilization with enough knowledge of astronomy and mathematics would perceive it. A society that hasn't yet learned to track the stars wouldn't notice precessional alignments. One that hasn't measured the Earth wouldn't see global geometry. This kind of selective legibility is similar to what we aim for with long-term warning markers for nuclear waste. We try to design symbols in landscapes that say danger clearly enough to be understood by future cultures, without relying on specific languages. But we also accept that some aspects of the warning will only be grasped by those who have a certain level of scientific understanding. Behind those efforts lies the same fear that may have motivated ancient builders, that a powerful hazard could persist beyond the lifespan of a civilization, and that the only hope is to warn those who come later. If that's what some ancient monuments are doing, their message might not be, "We were advanced," but something more practical. "This cycle repeats," or "This place is special or dangerous," or "Remember this alignment." As we study ancient works with modern tools, we are, in a sense, doing exactly what such a message requires. We measure, we map, we simulate the ancient sky. We discover that a shaft points to a star position thousands of years ago. We realize that a temple's architecture encodes a complex calendar. Each insight is like deciphering a word in a long, slow sentence. It is also possible that the message is less about specific warnings and more about perspective. Perhaps the builders were trying to pass on a way of seeing, a recognition that Earth, sky, and life form a single system. By tying their sacred structures to astronomical cycles, they were saying, "You are part of this larger pattern. Do not forget." If they also understood that civilizations come and go, they may have known that their own age was a temporary expression of that pattern. Their monuments, then, become continuity devices, bridges that keep knowledge flowing through the breaks. We are already seeing how this works in our time. Modern engineers study ancient structures to learn how they resist earthquakes and weather. Material scientists analyze Roman concrete to understand why it grows stronger underwater. Agronomists examine ancient terracing and irrigation systems to cope with modern climate stress. Without knowing the original intentions of their builders, we are still receiving practical lessons from their work. The message survives even when the script is lost. Some researchers go further and suggest that the Earth itself is part of the message. They propose that ancient sites were placed along fault lines, energy nodes, or specific latitudes for more than symbolic reasons. Perhaps the structures were meant to stabilize or tune the planet's energies, a form of geoengineering based on resonance and balance rather than exploitation. It's a difficult idea to test, but even if such claims are speculative, the underlying concept is powerful. That building should be done in harmony with the Earth's natural rhythms, not in opposition to them, and that any civilization that ignores those rhythms courts the kind of collapse that wipes its traces from memory. In that light, the greatest message left for us might be simple and urgent. Remember how to live with the planet, not against it. As we face our own environmental crises, That message feels less abstract. We're rediscovering the wisdom of ancient, low-impact techniques. We're learning to value systems that regenerate rather than deplete. The same curiosity that drives us to decode the past may be what helps us survive the future. If the first civilization did leave anything intentionally for us, it may not be a single artifact or hidden chamber. It may be the pattern itself, the global scattering of aligned stones, resonant chambers, and star-mirroring layouts. Taken individually, each site is mysterious. Taken together, they form a kind of planetary inscription. A network of reminders that intelligence existed here before, that the universe has been measured from this small world more than once, and that certain truths hold regardless of who discovers them. The implied instruction might be, connect the dots. Don't study only one ruin, one myth, one culture. Place them beside each other. See the pattern that emerges when you zoom out to the scale of the whole Earth. When we do, a picture slowly forms. A world that remembers, in its stones and stories, a long conversation between mind and cosmos. And that brings us to another part of the message. One not carved in monuments, but carried in what happens when civilizations finally fall silent. When a civilization ends, it rarely does so in a single dramatic moment. The sun still rises, the wind still blows, people still wake, cook, argue, and hope. What fades first is not the structures, but the rhythm, the steady hum of activity, of coordinated purpose. Silence arrives gradually, like dusk spreading along city streets. It begins with small absences. A workshop that never reopens after a bad season. A library whose doors remain locked. A bridge that no one bothers to repair. A drought stretches longer than usual. A war lasts a few years too many. Trade routes falter, population thins. One day, somewhere, a city stirs for the last time, unaware that its final sunrise is no different from any other. People go about their routines, thinking tomorrow will be much the same, but then the slow unraveling crosses a threshold. Those who leave never return. Those who stay are too few to maintain what once existed. The silence deepens. Every civilization we know has experienced some version of this fading. The Maya, whose calendars tracked vast spans of time, watched their cities swallowed by the jungle. The Romans, who considered their empire eternal, left theaters and aqueducts to crumble. The people of the Indus Valley, whose cities were laid out with modern-seeming precision, vanished so completely that even their language remains unreadable. No one within those societies likely believed that everything they'd built would someday stand empty. Yet the silence came all the same. What makes the silence so total is not just destruction, but forgetting. Stone structures remain for a while. Pottery and tools persist beneath the soil. But the knowledge of what those objects meant, the stories, technologies, and names dissolves. Later, peoples arrive, find these remnants, and reinterpret them through their own beliefs. A sophisticated water system becomes a sacred canal. An observatory becomes a temple. A machine may be mistaken for an altar. In filling the gap in understanding, myth is born. In that transformation, something dies, and something else is created. History turns into legend. Facts become symbols. The silence between the last living memory and the first new interpretation is like a dark interval between notes in a song. If an even earlier civilization, older than Sumer, older than the first pyramids, once reached a high level of complexity, its silence would have been deeper still. Its decline might have taken the form of rising seas, shifting climates, the sudden onset of ice or drought, comet impacts, or all of the above. The Earth, indifferent, would have continued turning as their cities eroded away. To erase nearly every trace of a complex society is not as difficult as it sounds. Give nature a few centuries and it will reclaim any structure not actively defended. Roofs fall, walls split, floors buckle, plants wedge themselves into cracks and pry stones apart. Metal bleaches and flakes away. Insects and microbes reduce everything organic to soil. In 10,000 years, most human-made objects become unrecognizable rubble. In 100,000, the land itself changes. Rivers alter course, mountains erode, sediment buries foundations. If continents shift, entire regions can vanish beneath new oceans or crumble into mountain ranges and then dust. It's humbling to realize that our own physical imprint could be almost completely erased on such timescales. The Earth doesn't need to actively destroy our works. It only needs time. The silence that follows a collapse is not blank, though. It is full of lives unfolding in new ways. Forests regrow where plazas once stood. Wildlife returns to territories cleared for roads and fields. Rivers cut new banks through old foundations. If any survivors knew what had been lost, their grief and memory would carry forward in stories. But as generations passed, the stories would shift. The shining towers would become palaces of the gods. The machines would become weapons of the sky. The real context would recede until only the emotional outline remained. In a profound sense, we may be living in the echo of such a silence already. Our myths of golden ages, of worlds destroyed and remade, of teachers arriving after catastrophe, may be the distant voice of those who lived through a previous ending. The silence between civilizations does something essential. It clears the stage. It allows the planet to heal from whatever stresses the last bloom of industry imposed. It also forces any new civilization to rediscover knowledge rather than simply inherit it intact. That rediscovery nurtures humility and curiosity, two qualities necessary for any deep understanding. We tend to interpret silence as failure or loss, but in the planet's rhythm, silence is part of the breathing. It's the exhale after an intense period of creation. A pause, not a void. Seen this way, the end of a civilization is not so much a permanent tragedy as a transformation. The structures fall, but the lessons remain, encoded in the earth and in whatever stories survive the collapse. Perhaps the first civilization, if it foresaw its own end, accepted that silence as inevitable. They might have known that their particular expression of intelligence was temporary, that the planet would eventually reclaim their works. They may have trusted that certain patterns they set in motion, ideas, alignments, ways of seeing, would persist long after their buildings were gone. The silence that followed would not be the erasure of everything they were, but the distillation of it. The noisy specifics would fade, leaving only the most robust elements, geometry embedded in monuments, astronomical awareness folded into myth, and a subtle influence on how later cultures instinctively shape their world. Modern thinkers sometimes speculate about the Great Filter, the idea that most civilizations in the universe might self-destruct before mastering interstellar travel. On Earth, the equivalent filter may be silence, the reset mechanisms built into the planet's own systems. Whether through climate, geology, or other limits, these resets ensure that no civilization can simply grow unchecked forever. Silence, in this sense, is a kind of mercy. It prevents any single attempt at intelligence from permanently destabilizing the planet. It grants opportunities for new beginnings, new forms of awareness, and new ways of relating to the world. Many spiritual traditions respect silence as something sacred, not empty. The pause in a chant, the stillness in meditation, the quiet between thoughts. These are seen as spaces where deeper understanding can arise. The same could be true at the scale of civilizations. Between the noise of one age and the noise of the next, there is a planetary stillness, a long, collective breath, a chance for memory to settle. When we walk among ruins today, we often feel a mixture of awe and melancholy. We think of what's been lost, languages no one speaks, names no one remembers. But the Earth may not view it as loss. To the planet, each civilization is a verse in a song that never truly ends. The silence that follows each verse isn't a failure of the song. It's where the next line gathers strength. Our own era, with its unprecedented reach and speed, can make us forget how fragile we are in geological terms. Yet the same processes that ended previous ages are still in play. Climate shifts, Tectonic plates move. Asteroids still cross our orbit. If our civilization were to fade, the silence that followed would be filled, as always, with the sounds of other lives. Wind, water, birds, and insects would continue their own intricate songs. A future intelligence rising from whatever line survives us might eventually find our traces. A few stubborn structures, altered layers in ice and rock, bits of plastic compressed into sediment. They'd wonder about us. They'd imagine our cities and speculate about our understanding. They might tell stories about a time when people could move mountains with machines, speak across the planet in an instant, and send their voices into space. Over generations, those stories would mythologize. We would become part of their legend. In that way, our own silence would seed a new round of memory and story. The pattern would repeat: rise, flourish, decline, silence, rediscovery. The thought is not as bleak as it first seems. It means that even after we are gone, we will be part of the planet's ongoing act of remembering. Our layer will be read by someone or something someday. The first civilization's silence, if it existed, functioned the same way. It became the foundation for everything that followed. We are living proof that silence is not the end of the story, but the space where the next chapter is prepared. Somewhere in that quiet interval, the earth gathers up what's worth keeping, lets the rest erode, and waits for new minds to open and ask questions. And what do those new minds do as soon as they can? They begin searching. Somewhere between the echoes of vanished worlds and the possibilities of future ones, there are people who listen deliberately. They're not prophets gazing into crystal balls or mystics reading omens in clouds. They are scientists, explorers, scholars, divers, and quiet thinkers whose work is driven by a single shared impulse: to remember. These are the searchers of our time. They step into deserts and jungles, climb cliffs, dive into cold, murky waters, and sift through pages of data from satellites, sensors, and cores. Their tools are new, but their motivation is ancient. Every trowel stroke, every scan, every calculation is an attempt to answer the same questions that haunted our ancestors. Who were we? How far back do we go? What have we forgotten? When an archaeologist crouches in the dust to gently brush soil from a fragment of pottery or bone, they are doing more than recovering an object. They are re-establishing a connection. The shard they hold might have been shaped by a hand thousands or tens of thousands of years ago. The distance in time collapses into a simple fact. Someone stood here once with needs and hopes and skills not so different from ours. In that small moment of contact, the silence between lives breaks. Modern archaeology has expanded far beyond trenches and brushes. Drones now scan landscapes from above, revealing faint outlines of walls and roads. Satellite imagery picks up subtle shifts in vegetation that hint at buried foundations. LiDAR, a laser mapping technology, strips away the canopy of forests in virtual space, exposing entire lost cities under the trees. In Central America, LiDAR has revealed extensive networks of roads, canals, and ceremonial centers hidden beneath jungle growth, evidence of societies far larger and more complex than previously known. What we once saw as unbroken wilderness turns out to be the overgrown skeleton of human design. Beneath the sea, sonar and remotely operated vehicles map the contours of submerged valleys and plateaus. Ruins like Pavlopetri in Greece, once coastal but now underwater, show us that sinking cities are not just metaphor. As technology improves, we find more hints of human presence along ancient shorelines walls, paved areas, strange rectilinear patterns on the seafloor. On land, ground-penetrating radar reveals layers beneath our feet. Walls under fields, chambers beneath temples, older streets beneath modern ones. In some cities, entire forgotten neighborhoods lie stacked beneath current structures. Time piled upon time. There's a kind of reverence in how carefully these layers are approached. A single careless excavation can destroy information that took centuries to accumulate. So the searchers move slowly, documenting everything, knowing that each detail might change the story. History is no longer a flat timeline in a book. It has become a moving picture, constantly revised as new data emerges. Discoveries that would have seemed outrageous a century ago, like vast cities in the Amazon or detailed submerged settlements, are now accepted, forcing us to redraw the boundaries of the known past. Other disciplines join the search. Geneticists trace ancient migrations by comparing DNA from living populations with samples extracted from old bones and teeth. They map paths across continents, showing how small groups of humans spread, merged, vanished, and resurfaced. Linguists reconstruct proto-languages, finding common roots among words scattered across cultures, hinting at deep interactions long before writing. Paleoclimatologists read tree rings and ice cores, reconstructing droughts, cold snaps, and long, rainy periods that shaped human choices: when to migrate, when to settle, when to abandon a region. Each of these fields is its own form of archaeology, uncovering layers not of soil, but of data. In labs, computers now comb through vast archives of satellite images looking for straight lines, right angles, and repeating shapes that nature rarely produces. Machine learning algorithms flag potential sites ordinary human eyes might miss: faint geometric outlines beneath vegetation, symmetrical mounds on steppe, submerged rectilinear shapes on the seafloor. This digital archaeology reveals how crowded our planet is with memory. Fields we thought were empty hide the footprints of vanished settlements. Hills we assumed were natural turn out to be burial mounds or ancient platforms. Even our oceans, once marked as featureless blue, are slowly being discovered as layered with human stories. Yet despite all this technology, the most crucial instrument remains human intuition. Many discoveries begin not with a machine, but with a person standing in a landscape, noticing something that feels off. A hill too regular, a pattern of stones too orderly, a river bend that seems oddly shaped. That feeling, this doesn't look entirely natural, is the spark that ignites careful investigation. Not all searchers wear academic titles. Some are divers who explore coastal shelves, recording strange formations and sending footage to scientists. Some are hikers who notice alignments of rocks or terraces in remote places. Some are amateur historians who pore over old maps and accounts, looking for clues to forgotten ruins. Some are storytellers who take oral traditions seriously, bringing local knowledge to the attention of researchers. All of them expand the reach of memory. There is something beautiful about how science and story are gradually reconciling. Once, they were placed on separate shelves. Now, a geologist might consult indigenous elders before interpreting a landscape. An astronomer might reference ancient myths to understand the purpose of an old observatory. An anthropologist might treat a legend not as superstition, but as data encoded in narrative form. Far from weakening science, this humility strengthens it. It acknowledges that memory isn't always stored in the medium we expect. Sometimes the oldest, most resilient archive isn't stone or ice, but story. The searchers of today are custodians of the Earth's memory in a new sense. They stand in the gap between silence and speech, translating what the planet has quietly recorded into something our present can understand. Every artifact cataloged, every site mapped, every genetic sequence reconstructed is another sentence drawn up from the depths of time. At the same time, they are acutely aware of how much is being lost. Development, looting, pollution, melting ice, and rising seas are threatening sites faster than we can document them. Ruins emerge from thawing permafrost only to decay once exposed. Forests cleared for agriculture reveal traces of old settlements one year and erase them the next. It is a race between remembrance and oblivion. Yet each success, each city found beneath a jungle, each submerged structure mapped, each myth confirmed as rooted in a real place or event, reaffirms something essential, that the past is not sealed off from us. It is still available to be heard, if we know how to listen. The searchers also look forward. They know that one day our own time will become archaeology. Our skyscrapers, landfills, and seafloor cables will be puzzling relics to whatever future minds arise. Our layer in the Earth's memory will be labeled, studied, and debated. Perhaps future searchers will marvel at how quickly we change the atmosphere, or at how advanced and yet how precarious our systems were. They might judge us harshly for what we destroyed, or gently for what we tried to preserve. Either way, we are already participating in the same long cycle. Rise, record, fall, rediscover. The work we do now to understand our deep past is also a way of preparing to be understood by those who follow. In that light, archaeology and related sciences are not just about digging up old things, they're about continuity, about maintaining a thread of awareness through the long silences that separate ages. The searchers of today are, knowingly or not, answering a call sent long ago. They are replying to the messages left in stone, myth, and sediment by the first builders and all who came after. The question those builders asked was simple. Will anyone remember us? Every excavation, every core, every decoded inscription is our answer. Yes, we hear you. There is a quiet conversation running beneath everything we do. It is older than writing, older than cities, older than any single civilization. It doesn't depend on speech, yet it never truly falls silent. It's the ongoing exchange between humanity and the earth, between what we build and what endures, between what we remember and what we lose. Every stone set in place, every myth repeated around a fire, every map drawn, every question asked, all are contributions to that dialogue. We usually picture history as a line with dates and arrows, but it might be more accurate to see it as an echo chamber where voices from different eras overlap and reply to each other without ever meeting. One civilization rises, speaks in its own way, falters, and falls quiet. Another emerges later, hearing only faint reverberations, yet responds to them instinctively. The searchers of our time are just the latest speakers in this conversation. Before them came the architects of forgotten cities, the storytellers who turned memory into legend, the survivors who carried fragments of understanding through long, dark periods of loss. And before them, perhaps, came the first civilization, the one that inscribed its message in stone and proportion rather than on fragile scrolls. Each age believes it speaks for the first time. In reality, it is picking up a thread mid-sentence. The conversation begins in curiosity, with the simple, persistent question, what is this, and why does it exist? It's the question that led the first humans to tip their heads back and stare at the night sky. The same question pushed them to align stones with the sun's path, to track the seasons, to carve symbols. It's the same question that drives modern astronomers to peer into galaxies and physicists to probe the smallest particles. Curiosity is how the Earth becomes aware of itself. When we ask questions about the world, we're not standing outside it. We are part of its process of understanding. Each civilization adds its own dialect to this conversation. The earliest engineers used stone and alignment as their grammar. Classical philosophers added logic and written discourse. Medieval scholars spoke through illuminated manuscripts and cathedrals. Modern scientists speak in equations, peer-reviewed papers, and data. Now our technology extends that voice beyond the planet radio signals, space probes, digital archives. The medium changes, but the impulse is the same. We're still trying to comprehend what the first skywatchers and monument builders intuited, that we are embedded in a vast, ordered mystery. Conversations require listening as much as talking. That's something we often neglect. Ancient peoples listened deeply to the changing winds, the patterns of bird migrations, the subtle shifts in the stars' rising points, the health of soil and water. Their survival depended on it. Their monuments suggest that this listening was not only practical, but reverential. Aligning stones to solstices, tracking lunar standstills, situating temples near springs or fault lines, all of this implies attention. They were calibrating their lives to the Earth's rhythms. As time went on, our ability to speak grew louder. We invented engines, industry, and global networks. Our noise, literal and metaphorical, rose. Yet our listening often diminished. We paved over wetlands, straightened rivers, brightened the night sky until the stars disappeared from many places, and drowned natural cues under artificial ones. Still, the Earth replies. It answers our actions through feedback loops. Storms, droughts, floods, shifts in ecosystems. These are not punishments, but responses. They are the planet's side of the conversation, telling us when balance is slipping. The first civilization, if it existed, might have understood this reciprocity more clearly. Their works hint at a worldview in which knowledge and respect were not separate. To measure the cosmos was simultaneously a scientific and spiritual act. To align a temple with a star was both geometry and gratitude. Their language seems to have been one of resonance, between structure and sight, between story and sky. When modern researchers study their alignments and ratios, they are essentially reading old sentences. A temple that marks the solstice is saying, "We observed this turning of the year and found it worthy of stone." A complex whose layout mirrors a constellation is saying, "We saw ourselves in the stars." When we experience such places at the right moment, a dawn on the equinox, a sunset aligning with an ancient gate, we temporarily step back into that conversation. For a brief time, the monument functions as intended again, and we understand, not with words, but with a feeling of rightness. The dialogue isn't only across time, it's within each of us. Every person who feels wonder under a clear night sky, who traces the curve of a fossil shell with their thumb, who pauses at a ruin and imagines the lives once lived there, that person is participating in the same ancient exchange. Even without training, children ask the same questions that philosophers and priests have asked. Why is there something rather than nothing? What came before us? What happens after? These questions are older than any civilization. They keep reappearing because reality prompts them whenever a mind is awake enough to notice. If the first civilization truly grasped something fundamental about our place in the universe, they might have tried to embed that understanding in the most durable forms they could find: the alignment of stones, the structure of myths, and the training of attention. They may have realized that messages carved in words can be lost, but patterns carved in reality itself will be rediscovered. As long as there are stars, someone will eventually look up and count them. As long as the earth turns, someone will notice the seasons. As long as there are ruins, someone will ask, "Who built this?" In that way, their legacy might not be specific technologies or doctrines, but the habits of mind they fostered: aligning, measuring, mapping, listening. We imitate that legacy every time we launch a space probe with a star map engraved on it. Every time we propose a universal symbol to warn distant generations of nuclear waste. Every time we design a structure meant to last beyond our own lives. We are speaking the same language, using equations and engineering instead of megaliths and myths. And perhaps, somewhere else in the universe, similar conversations are happening. Other worlds, other civilizations, rising and falling, asking their own versions of, who are we? And what are we part of? If intelligence is common, the cosmos might be full of these dialogues, planetary minds awakening through their inhabitants, talking to themselves through millennia. When we send radio signals into space, we're joining that larger chorus. Whether anyone hears us is almost beside the point. The act itself is a continuation of a pattern, awareness reaching beyond its immediate surroundings, saying, "We are here. We know that we are here. We want to know who else is here." Perhaps the first civilization on Earth did something similar in its own way, not with radio waves, but with geometry and global design. They might have known that any future intelligence able to decode those patterns would share something fundamental with them: the capacity to recognize order and to ask questions about it. The timeless conversation, then, doesn't rely on shared vocabulary or uninterrupted memory. It relies on the recurrence of awareness. Whenever a mind looks at the world and wonders, the conversation resumes. When that first civilization fell silent, they didn't stop the dialogue. They passed it on, through the earth, through myth, through patterns that we are only now learning to notice. When we, too, eventually fall silent, whatever follows us will inherit the same questions. They will build their own monuments, tell their own stories, and discover their own sciences. The earth will keep turning, carrying all these voices past, present, and potential future across the sky. Perhaps that is the closest thing to immortality we get. not the survival of any single culture or species, but the persistence of questioning itself, the continuity of curiosity. The question that has echoed since the first eyes turned upward, what are we part of, is both the beginning and the end of the conversation. Every civilization asks it. Every silence refines it. Every rediscovery offers a new answer. One day, a civilization might arise that understands fully what our first builders only glimpsed, that the question and the answer are not separate. That to be part of the universe is to be the universe asking about itself. Until then, the Earth listens and replies in its own slow ways. It erases but also preserves. It silences but also resets. It forgets details but remembers patterns. And we, for as long as we're here, stand between remembering and forgetting, between noise and quiet, between stone and story. We add our verse to the song. We listen for echoes. We leave clues in the hope that someone will one day understand them. And as the dawn of some distant future rises, another mind will look back at our ruins, feel that odd familiarity, and know, without knowing how, that this has all happened before. They'll step into the conversation where we left off, and the Earth, as always, will carry their voices forward under the turning stars.